There are thinkers whose ideas remain safely confined to the university classroom, debated by scholars and read by a handful of students. Their influence is a quiet academic affair. And then there are thinkers whose ideas explode out of the library and set the world on fire. No philosopher in the last 200 years has had a more explosive, more consequential, and more controversial impact on the material reality of human life than Karl Marx. His name is not just a name, it is an incantation, a curse, a prayer. It is a name that has been invoked to justify revolutions that have overthrown empires. It has been the official doctrine of states that have governed billions of human lives. The great political drama of the 20th century, the Cold War, was fought between nations that organized themselves around his ideas and nations that defined themselves in opposition to them. From the streets of Petersburg to the fields of China, from the jungles of Cuba to the heart of intellectual debate in Paris and Berlin, his ghost has haunted the modern world, and this leads us to the great and difficult paradox of his legacy. He was a man who wrote with a burning, passionate, and deeply moral rage against the exploitation and the dehumanization of the poor. He was a prophet who dreamed of a future of ultimate human liberation, a world free from oppression and inequality. And yet his name would come to be associated with some of the most oppressive, most tyrannical, and most murderous regimes in all of human history. The communist states of the 20th century, ruling in his name, were responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of people, for the creation of vast systems of concentration camps, and for the total suppression of the very human freedom he claimed to champion. How can we make sense of this? Was he a misunderstood humanist whose ideas were tragically betrayed? Or was he a dangerous ideologue whose theories contained the hidden seeds of the tyranny that would follow? This is the central question that we will wrestle with in this series. To do this, we must look beyond the Marxism of the 20th century. We must go back to the man himself, to his life, to his method, and to the brilliant and devastating critique of the modern world that he unleashed from a small, cluttered desk in the reading room of the British Museum. We must understand that Marx was not just another political theorist. He saw himself as a scientist. He believed he had discovered the secret objective and unchangeable laws of motion that governed human history and the capitalist system. He was, in his own mind, the Isaac Newton of social science. But this scientific project was fueled by a profound and personal biographical agony. His critique of capitalism was not an abstract academic exercise. It was his own lived, daily reality. Karl Marx was a man without a country. He was a political refugee, a radical intellectual who was hounded from his native Germany, then from France, then from Belgium, by the secret police of Europe. He spent the majority of his adult life as a stateless exile in the one city that would tolerate him, London. And there, in the capital of the greatest industrial and colonial empire on earth, he lived a life of almost unimaginable hardship. He and his family were crammed into a few squalid rooms in the slum of Soho. He lived in a state of grinding, relentless poverty. There were days when he could not leave the house because his wife, Jenny, had to pawn his only coat to buy food. He was constantly in debt, constantly begging for money from his friends, constantly being hounded by creditors. This was not a romantic bohemian poverty. It was a brutal, soul-crushing reality that had devastating consequences. He and Jenny had 6 children, but only 3 of them survived to adulthood. Several of them died in infancy and childhood from diseases that were a direct result of the malnutrition and the unsanitary conditions they were forced to live in. It was in the midst of this personal hell, this direct, daily experience of the cruelty of the 19th century capitalist system, that he wrote his great works. Every day, he would escape the misery of his own home and walk to the magnificent reading room of the British Museum. And there, surrounded by the greatest collection of books in the world, he would work for 10, 12, sometimes 14 hours a day, obsessively, relentlessly, researching and writing his magnum opus, Das Kapital. He sacrificed his own health, which was never good, and the well-being of his own family for the sake of this monumental intellectual project. He was sustained through it all by the one great friendship of his life, his collaboration with Friedrich Engels. Engels, the son of a wealthy factory owner, was the one who often paid Marx's rent, bought his family food, and gave him the financial freedom to continue his revolutionary work. We must understand this to understand Marx. His philosophy was not born from a detached, scholarly curiosity. It was forged in the fires of personal suffering, of exile, of poverty, and of a profound and righteous anger at a world that he saw as fundamentally unjust. To understand this vast and complex body of work, our journey will be divided into 4 major phases. First, we will explore the man and his method. We will look at his early life, his revolutionary partnership with Engels, and the creation of his core philosophical tool, dialectical and historical materialism. Next, we will perform a deep dive into the anatomy of a system, his brilliant and devastating critique of capitalism. We will explore his theories of class struggle, of alienation, of surplus value, and of the strange, mystical power of commodities. Then, we will turn to the coming revolution. We will analyze his famous Communist Manifesto, his prophecy of the inevitable collapse of capitalism, and his controversial vision for a future communist society. And finally, we will grapple with the legacy and the rubble. We will explore the many Marxisms that came after him. We will confront the terrible question of his relationship to the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, and we will ask what, if anything, Karl Marx still has to teach us in the 20th. But before we begin this journey, we must understand the single, revolutionary idea that drove his entire life's work. It is an idea that he wrote down as a young man in a short, unpublished text that would only be discovered long after his death. It is his famous 11th thesis on the German philosopher Feuerbach, and it is the statement that separates him from almost every philosopher who came before him. He wrote, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it." This is the key. Marx was not interested in creating another abstract system to be debated in universities. He saw his ideas as weapons. He believed that his philosophy was not just a tool for understanding the world, but a tool for the oppressed to take up, to understand the true nature of their own situation, and through that understanding to finally overthrow it. And so we are confronted with the great driving paradox of Karl Marx. He was the ultimate materialist, a man who argued that history was governed by cold, impersonal, and determinist economic laws. And yet he lived the life of a fiery, impassioned prophet, sacrificing everything for a revolutionary faith in the future of humanity. He wrote thousands of dense scientific pages to prove that the fall of capitalism was a historical inevitability. And then he spent every waking hour of his life organizing, agitating, and conspiring to make that inevitability happen sooner. He was a scientist who became a revolutionary, a man who sought to discover the laws of history in order to become their willing and conscious executioner. This revolutionary desire, this absolute commitment to not just interpret the world, but to change it, was not born in a vacuum. It was forged in the intellectual firestorm of 19th century Germany, in the mind of a young man who began his journey not as an economist or a political agitator, but as a poet, a lover, and a radical philosopher. To understand the creator of Marxism, we must first understand the intellectual world of the young Karl Marx, and the great philosophical giant whose shadow he had to escape in order to find his own voice. Karl Marx was born in 1818 in the quiet provincial town of Trier, in the German Rhineland. He was not born into the proletariat he would later champion. He was the son of a successful and comfortably middle-class lawyer. His family background was a complex one. He was descended from a long line of Jewish rabbis on both sides, but his father, Herschel, had converted to Protestantism a year before Karl was born. This was not an act of profound religious conviction. It was a pragmatic necessity. Under the repressive laws of the Prussian state at the time, Jews were barred from many public offices and professions. The conversion was an act of social and economic survival. This placed the young Marx in a unique position. He was raised in a liberal, enlightened, and largely secular household, steeped in the ideas of Kant and Voltaire. Yet he was always an outsider, a man of Jewish heritage in an anti-Semitic society, a man whose family had sacrificed its ancestral identity for the sake of bourgeois respectability. As a young man at university, first in Bonn and then in Berlin, he was not a disciplined scholar. He was a passionate, romantic, and rebellious spirit. He drank heavily. He fought a duel. He accumulated massive debts, and he wrote volumes of tortured romantic poetry to his future wife, the aristocratic Jenny von Westphalen, who had fallen in love with his brilliant and ferocious mind. But beneath this romantic exterior, a powerful intellect was awakening. He abandoned his father's wish for him to study law and plunged headfirst into the most demanding and most prestigious intellectual discipline of his time: philosophy. And to be a young, ambitious philosopher in Germany in the 1830s meant one thing. It meant you had to confront the ghost of the man who had, just a few years earlier, completely dominated the intellectual world. That man was Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. It is impossible to overstate the influence of Hegel on Marx's generation. His philosophical system was a vast, intricate, and all-encompassing cathedral of thought. He had created a grand, sweeping theory that claimed to explain the entirety of reality, of history, of human consciousness. The core of Hegel's system was the idea that history is not a random series of events. It is the rational, logical, and purposeful unfolding of what he called the Weltgeist, the world spirit, as it journeys towards a state of complete self-knowledge and freedom. And the engine that drives this historical journey is a process he called the dialectic. The dialectic is a three-beat rhythm. First, you have a thesis, an existing idea or state of affairs. This thesis inevitably generates its own internal contradiction, its opposite, the antithesis. The conflict between the thesis and the antithesis is then resolved into a new, higher, and more complex state, the synthesis. This synthesis then becomes the new thesis, and the process begins all over again. For Hegel, this was a drama of ideas. History was the story of the world spirit thinking its way to freedom. When Hegel died in 1831, his followers split into two warring camps. The old Hegelians were the conservatives. They believed that the dialectical process had reached its triumphant conclusion. The Prussian state, with its constitutional monarchy and its efficient bureaucracy, was, they argued, the final and highest expression of the world spirit's journey. History was over. But there was another group, a group of brilliant, rebellious, and radical young thinkers. They were the young Hegelians, and they believed the exact opposite. They believed that the master's dialectical method was a tool of revolution, not of conservation. They argued that the Prussian state was not the end of history, but was just another thesis, full of its own contradictions. Its poverty, its political repression, its state-sponsored religion that must be overcome by a new antithesis. When the young Karl Marx arrived in Berlin, he dove headfirst into this radical intellectual scene. He became a leading member of the Doctors' Club, the inner circle of the young Hegelians. These were the irritable troublemakers of their day, brilliant, atheistic critics of religion and the state. Their first great target was religion, and their great hero was a philosopher named Ludwig Feuerbach. In his explosive book, The Essence of Christianity, Feuerbach took Hegel's idealism and gave it a revolutionary, materialist twist. The secret of theology, he argued, is anthropology. God did not create man in his own image. Man created God in his own image. We take all of our own highest human potentials, our capacity for love, for wisdom, for power. We project them onto an imaginary, transcendent screen, and then we worship our own alienated essence as if it were a separate being. Religion is a form of human alienation. This idea was an earthquake for Marx and his generation. It showed them a way to keep Hegel's powerful dialectical method, but to turn it on its head. It suggested that the driving force of history was not some abstract mystical world spirit, but the real, material, and suffering human being. Armed with this new insight, Marx left the university and entered the real world. He became the editor of a radical liberal newspaper, the Rheinische Zeitung. And it was here that his biographical agony, his lifelong career as a revolutionary exile, began. For the first time, Marx was forced to write not just about abstract philosophical concepts, but about the concrete, material problems of real people. He wrote a series of brilliant and incendiary articles about the desperate poverty of the peasant wine-growers in the Moselle Valley. He saw how the laws of the state, which were supposed to be the expression of universal reason, were in fact just a tool used by the wealthy forest owners to oppress the poor. This was the great turning point. He realized that to understand the world, you had to understand not just philosophy and religion, but economics. You had to understand who owned what, and how the state served the interests of the property-owning class. His journalism was too effective. The Prussian government, terrified of his radical voice, shut down the newspaper and drove him into exile. He moved to Paris, the revolutionary heart of Europe at the time. And it was there, in 1844, that he had the most important meeting of his life. He was introduced to a young man named Friedrich Engels. Engels was the perfect complement to Marx. While Marx was the abstract, Hegelian-trained philosopher, Engels was a man with direct first-hand experience of the brutal reality of the new industrial world. He was the son of a wealthy German factory owner, and he had spent 2 years working in his father's textile mill in Manchester, England, the crucible of the Industrial Revolution. He had walked the slums. He had seen the child labor. He had documented the horrific poverty, the disease, and the degradation of the new industrial working class, the proletariat. His book, The Condition of the Working Class in England, was a detailed empirical and devastating exposé of the human cost of capitalism. Engels provided the raw, factual data for Marx's grand philosophical theories. Marx had the dialectical method. Engels had the economic reality. It was the beginning of the most famous and most consequential intellectual partnership of the modern era. And so the stage was set. The great philosophy of materialism was born not in a factory, but in a university seminar room, from the most idealist philosophy ever conceived. The man who would become the great prophet of the proletariat was not a worker himself, but a bourgeois intellectual, steeped in poetry and Greek philosophy. And to begin his great war against the capitalist class, his first and most essential ally was the son of a capitalist. This is the great contradictory crucible in which the revolution was born. This revolutionary partnership between Marx the philosopher and Engels the empirical observer, forged in the exile cafes of Paris and the grimy streets of industrial Manchester, would give birth to a new and explosive way of seeing the world. Before Marx could launch his great assault on the capitalist system, he first had to forge his primary intellectual weapon. He needed a method, he needed a new philosophy that could not only critique the world, but could explain its deepest laws of motion. A philosophy that was both scientific and revolutionary. To do this, he had to return to the ghost that haunted all of German thought. He had to return to Hegel. Marx knew that Hegel's dialectic was the most powerful tool for understanding history as a process of dynamic, conflict-driven change. But he also knew, thanks to thinkers like Feuerbach, that Hegel's system was, in a sense, floating in the air. It was a philosophy of pure spirit, of abstract ideas. Hegel's great error, Marx concluded, was that he had mistaken the shadow for the substance. He believed that the real, material world of human life was just a messy, imperfect reflection of a higher, rational unfolding of the world spirit. Marx, in a famous and brilliant act of philosophical inversion, declared that the opposite was true. The ideas, the philosophies, the religions, the great spiritual dramas of history, these were not the cause of historical change, they were the effect. They were the shadows, the echoes, the reflections cast by the real, material, grinding, and often brutal reality of human economic life. He took Hegel's powerful, dynamic, dialectical engine, and he ripped it out of the heavens of pure spirit. He dragged it down to earth and planted it in the mud, the blood, and the soil of human labor. He turned Hegel on his head. This is the birth of his new system, the foundation of his entire worldview. It is the philosophy of dialectical materialism, and its application to history is called historical materialism. To understand this is to possess the master key to all of Marx's later work. Let us begin with the materialist foundation. What, for Marx, is the ultimate determining force in human society? It is not our ideas. It is not our politics. It is not our religion. It is how we, as a species, produce the material necessities of life. At its very root, human history is the story of our relationship with nature. We are animals who must eat, who must clothe ourselves, who must find shelter. The fundamental activity of human life is production. It is labor, and this productive activity, he argued, can be broken down into two components. First, there are the forces of production. This is the technological and material side of the equation. It includes the raw materials, the land, the tools, the factories, the machinery, and the scientific knowledge that a society possesses at any given time. Second, And more importantly, there are the relations of production. This is the social side. This describes how human beings are organized to use those forces of production. And for Marx, this is fundamentally a question of ownership. Who owns the tools? Who owns the land? Who owns the factories? This relationship of ownership is what determines the class structure of a society. Together, the forces and the relations of production form what Marx called the economic base or the mode of production. This is the foundation. This is the real, material, and determining reality of any society. And from this economic base, he argued, arises what he called the superstructure. The superstructure is everything else. It is a society's legal system, its political institutions, its religion, its art, its philosophy, its morality. This is Marx's most radical and most controversial claim. He is arguing that the superstructure is not an independent reality. It is a direct reflection and a justification of the economic base. Your laws are not a reflection of some abstract divine justice. They are, at their root, a system for protecting the property relations of the dominant class. Your dominant religion is not a pure spiritual truth. It is a form of spiritual opium, an ideology that helps to keep the oppressed classes in their place by promising them a reward in the next life, while justifying the power of the ruling class in this one. Your philosophy, your art, your common sense morality, all of it, he argues, is fundamentally shaped by the economic realities of your time. The ruling ideas of any age are always the ideas of its ruling class. This is the materialist interpretation of history. To understand why a society thinks the way it does, you do not look at its great thinkers, you look at who owns the factory. Now Marx takes this materialist foundation and he reapplies Hegel's dialectical engine to it. History, for Marx, is not a smooth, linear progression. It is a series of violent, revolutionary leaps driven by the internal contradictions within the economic base itself. Here is how the materialist dialectic works. A given historical era, a thesis, is defined by its mode of production, for example, the feudal system of the Middle Ages. The relations of production, lords and serfs, are for a time in harmony with the forces of production, agricultural technology, land-based economy. But over time, the forces of production inevitably develop. New technologies are invented, new forms of trade emerge. A new class of people, the merchants and the craftsmen in the towns, begins to grow in economic power. This creates a contradiction, a tension. The new dynamic forces of production are now constrained by the old, rigid, and outdated relations of production. The feudal system, with its guilds and its land-based aristocracy, is now acting as a fetter, a set of chains, on the growth of this new, emerging capitalist economy. This is the antithesis, the contradiction between the developing forces and the old relations of production. This conflict cannot be resolved through gradual reform. It builds and builds until it erupts in a period of social revolution. This is the synthesis. The new, rising class, in this case, the bourgeoisie, overthrows the old, dominant class. The feudal aristocracy. They shatter the old relations of production and create a new social and political superstructure that is in harmony with their own mode of production. And this new synthesis, capitalism, now becomes the new thesis. And within it, new contradictions will inevitably begin to grow, leading to the next revolutionary crisis. This is the engine of history. For Marx, it is not the world spirit thinking its way to freedom. It is a series of class struggles, a series of revolutions driven by the contradictions between how we produce things and how our society is owned and organized. The biographical agony that drove Marx to create this grand scientific theory of history was his own profound need to find a certainty, a law, a guarantee that the suffering he saw all around him was not meaningless. After his break with the abstract idealism of the young Hegelians, he was not content with mere moral critique. To simply say that capitalism was unjust was, for him, a weak and sentimental position. He wanted to prove with the irrefutable force of a scientific law that capitalism was not just unjust, but that it was historically doomed, that it was a temporary, self-contradictory, and self-destructive system that was inevitably creating the conditions for its own revolutionary overthrow. His entire vast and often difficult economic analysis in Das Kapital is not just a description of capitalism. It is an attempt to lay out the precise scientific laws by which the system's own internal contradictions would lead to its collapse. He had to believe that history was on his side. This is what makes his philosophy so powerful and so dangerous. By turning Hegel on his head, he created a system that was both a scientific explanation of the past and a revolutionary prophecy about the future. He was not just a philosopher, he was a scientist who believed he had discovered the secret code of human history. And this code told him that the long, violent, and tragic story of human oppression was not a random series of accidents. It was a logical, determined, and dialectical process that was leading, with the certainty of a law of nature, to one final, great, and ultimate revolution. A revolution that would not just create a new ruling class, but would abolish class itself, and usher in the end of history as we know it. This grand materialist vision of history, this world in which our ideas and our institutions are just a shadow cast by the economic realities of our time, is not a static picture, it is a drama. A violent, tragic, and ultimately, for Marx, a hopeful drama. But what is the engine that drives this drama forward? If history is not pulled by a divine purpose or a rational world spirit, then what is the force that pushes it, that shatters old worlds and creates new ones? Marx's answer is the single most important and most famous thesis of his entire historical system. It is the central, bloody, and relentless motor of all human development. The engine of history is class struggle. In the electrifying opening lines of the Communist Manifesto, Marx and Engels announced this principle with the force of a divine revelation. The history of all hitherto existing society, they declare, is the history of class struggles. This is not a minor claim. This is a total reinterpretation of the entire human story. He is arguing that if you want to understand the rise and fall of empires, the great religious conflicts, the epic political revolutions, you must look beneath the surface of the official story. You must look away from the kings, the popes, the generals, and the great ideas. You must look instead at the silent, grinding, and permanent war that is being waged in every society between the haves and the have-nots, between the oppressors and the oppressed. To understand this, we must first understand what Marx means by the word class. For him, class is not a matter of culture, of income, of social status, or of education. These are all symptoms, not the cause. Class is a scientific, economic category. Your class is determined by one thing and one thing only: your relationship to the means of production. In any given society, there are two fundamental and opposing classes. First, there is the class that owns the means of production. They own the land, the tools, the factories, the raw materials. This is the dominant ruling class. They do not need to work to survive. They live off the labor of others. Second, there is the class that does not own the means of production. They own nothing but their own ability to labor. To survive, they must sell their labor power to the owning class. This is the subordinate, oppressed class. These are the two great, warring armies of history. And the conflict between them is not an accident. It is not a misunderstanding that can be solved with better communication or a more compassionate politics. It is a structural, objective, and irreconcilable antagonism. The interests of the two classes are fundamentally and permanently opposed. What benefits the owning class, longer working hours, lower wages, more efficient forms of exploitation, directly harms the working class. And what benefits the working class, shorter hours, higher wages, more control over their own labor, directly harms the profits of the owning class. It is a zero-sum game. And this silent, constant, grinding struggle is the secret engine that drives all of historical change. Let us follow Marx as he applies this dialectical lens to the grand sweep of Western history. He begins with the ancient mode of production, the world of Greece and Rome. The fundamental class division here was between master and slave. The master was a citizen who owned not only the land and the tools, the great agricultural estates, the mines, but who also owned the bodies of other human beings. The slave was not a person. He was, in the words of Aristotle, a living tool. He was an instrument of production, like an ox or a plow. The entire magnificent superstructure of the ancient world, its philosophy, its art, its democracy, was for Marx built upon this brutal foundation of slave labor. The leisure that allowed Plato to philosophize and Pericles to practice politics was a leisure made possible by the stolen labor of millions of human beings who had been stripped of their own humanity. But this system contained the seeds of its own destruction. The great contradiction of the ancient world was that its economic engine required a constant supply of new slaves, which could only be acquired through continuous military conquest. As the Roman Empire expanded to its geographical limits, as the supply of new conquests dried up, the slave-based economy began to stagnate and then to collapse. The internal contradiction between the system's needs and its material possibilities led to a long period of decline and crisis. And from the ashes of this collapsed Roman world, a new synthesis, a new mode of production, eventually emerged. This was the era of feudalism. In the feudal mode of production, the primary class division was between lord and serf. The slave was now gone. The serf was not the direct property of the lord. He was not a living tool. He had a certain set of rights. He had a family. He had a small plot of land that he was allowed to cultivate for his own subsistence. But he was not free. He was tied to the land. He could not leave it. And he was obligated, by law and by custom, to perform a certain amount of unpaid labor for his lord. He had to work a certain number of days a week on the lord's domain, his private fields, and he had to turn over a significant portion of his own produce to the lord as a form of rent. The feudal lord, the aristocratic warrior class, owned the primary means of production, the land. The serf was the exploited class, whose surplus labor supported the entire military and religious superstructure of the medieval world. The castles, the cathedrals, the knights and the priests. For centuries, this system was stable. But deep within its structures, the seeds of the next great revolution were quietly beginning to grow. New technologies were emerging, new types of plows, new methods of crop rotation. Trade began to revive. And in the medieval towns and cities, a new class of people, independent of the feudal agricultural system, began to rise in importance. These were the merchants, the craftsmen, the artisans. They were the bourgeoisie. They did not own land. They owned a new kind of property, capital. They owned workshops, they owned ships, they owned money. And their entire way of life was based on a new and dynamic principle, not the static tradition of the countryside, but the restless, expanding logic of the market. This was the great contradiction of the late Middle Ages. The new dynamic capitalist forces of production, centered in the towns, were being choked and constrained by the old rigid feudal relations of production. The guilds, the tolls, the aristocratic privileges, all of these were chains holding back the new economic power of the bourgeoisie. The conflict between these two worlds, between the feudal aristocracy and the rising bourgeoisie, was the great class struggle that defined the early modern period. This was not just an economic conflict. It was a conflict that expressed itself in the superstructure. The Protestant Reformation for Marx was not just a theological dispute. It was the religious expression of the rising bourgeoisie's demand for a new kind of individualistic, anti-authoritarian faith that was more compatible with the spirit of capitalism. The great political revolutions of the 17th and 18th centuries, the English Civil War, the French Revolution, were for him the final violent and decisive battles in this long class war. They were the moments when the bourgeoisie, having already achieved economic dominance, finally seized political power. They shattered the old feudal world, they executed the king, they abolished aristocratic privilege, and they created a new political and legal superstructure that was perfectly designed to serve the needs of their own mode of production. The modern capitalist nation-state, with its emphasis on private property, free trade, and individual rights. And so, a new synthesis was born. But this was not the end of history. It was simply the beginning of the final act in the long and bloody drama. For in destroying the old world of feudalism, the bourgeoisie had, in the process, created a new and far larger oppressed class. A class of people who owned nothing but their own labor, who were freed from the land only to be forced into the dark, satanic mills of the new industrial cities. This was the proletariat. The biographical agony that drove Marx's entire historical vision was his profound and personal identification with this dialectical process. He saw himself as living through the great final contradiction. He saw the immense creative and world-changing power of the bourgeoisie, a class that had, in his famous words, created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. But he also saw, with his own eyes, in the slums of London, in the suffering of his own family, the brutal, inhuman, and ultimately self-destructive logic of the system they had created. His grand theory of history was not just a scholarly analysis. It was a declaration of war. It was his attempt to give the new, rising, and still unconscious proletariat a scientific understanding of its own historical mission. He had to show them that their own private, individual suffering was not a random accident. It was a necessary and predictable product of a historical process. And that this same historical process, with the force of an iron law, was creating the very conditions for their own ultimate victory. History, for Marx, is not a story of great men or great ideas. It is a slaughterhouse. It is a relentless, impersonal, and violent process, driven forward by the grinding, irreconcilable conflict between those who own and those who work. Every single stage of human progress has been built upon the backs of a new and more efficiently exploited class of human beings, and the entire bloody, tragic, and magnificent story of civilization is in the end nothing more than the story of this single, eternal, and world-creating struggle. This great, revolutionary triumph of the bourgeoisie, this shattering of the old feudal world, was not, for Marx, the end of the historical drama. It was merely the setting of the stage for the final act. In creating the modern capitalist world, the bourgeoisie had not abolished class conflict. It had, instead, simplified it. It had cleared away the complex, confusing, and often overlapping hierarchies of the medieval world. The kings, the nobles, the guild masters, the journeymen, the serfs, and it had replaced them with a single, great, and final conflict. A conflict that would define the entire modern era. This is the conflict between the two great classes that capitalism itself had created. The two final antagonists in the long and bloody story of human history, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. To understand the modern world, Marx insists, you must first understand these two great warring armies. Let us begin with the victor of the last great war, the new ruling class of the modern age, the bourgeoisie. The term comes from the French word for the inhabitants of a walled town, or bourg. They were the merchants, the master craftsmen, the bankers who had emerged in the late Middle Ages. But for Marx, in the 19th century, the term has a precise scientific meaning. The bourgeoisie are the owners of capital. They are the class that owns the modern means of production, the factories, the machinery, the raw materials, the land, and the vast sums of money necessary to set them in motion. Now, Marx was not a simple, moralistic critic of the bourgeoisie. He did not see them as just a collection of greedy, evil men. In fact, in the pages of the Communist Manifesto, he writes about their historical role with a kind of awe, with a profound and almost terrifying admiration. The bourgeoisie, he writes, has been the most revolutionary class in all of human history. It was the bourgeoisie, he argues, that finally shattered the stagnant, tradition-bound world of feudalism. They have, in his famous words, pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. They have drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism, in the icy water of egotistical calculation. They were the great modernizers. They replaced superstition with science, tradition with reason, and the slow, cyclical life of the countryside with the frantic, dynamic, and ever-changing life of the modern city. And in the space of just a few centuries, they had created a world of almost unimaginable power and productivity. He writes, the bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. They have subjected nature's forces to man. They have created machinery, the application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs. They have cleared whole continents for cultivation. They have canalized rivers. They have conjured whole populations out of the ground. This is not the language of a man who does not respect his enemy. Marx saw the bourgeoisie as a class of immense, world-creating, and almost magical power. But this revolutionary power came at a terrible price. In the very act of creating this new, modern world, the bourgeoisie had also, by necessity, created a new and far larger class of human beings. A class of people who had been stripped of everything. A class that owned nothing but their own capacity to work. This is the proletariat. The word comes from the Latin proletarius, which was the term for the lowest class of Roman citizens, people who owned no property and whose only contribution to the state was to produce offspring, or pro. For Marx, the proletariat are the modern wage laborers. They do not own any means of production, they do not own a factory, or a machine, or even the tools of their own trade. They have been freed from the land and from the old guild system. But this freedom is a brutal and ironic one. They are free in the sense that they are no longer tied to a feudal lord, but they are also free from any other means of supporting themselves. They have only one thing left to sell in the marketplace, their own labor power. To survive, the proletarian has no choice but to sell their time, their energy, their very life force to a capitalist in exchange for a wage. How was this vast, propertyless class created? Marx argues that it was created through a violent historical process he called primitive accumulation. In countries like England for centuries, the peasantry had a traditional right to use the commons, common lands that were used for grazing animals and gathering firewood. Beginning in the late Middle Ages, the new rising capitalist class began the process of the enclosures. They privatized these common lands, fencing them off to create more efficient, large-scale sheep farms to supply the growing wool industry. This process, which was enforced by the state, drove millions of self-sufficient peasants off the land. It was a brutal act of mass expropriation. These people were turned, overnight, into vagabonds and beggars. They had lost their connection to the means of their own survival. They had no choice but to migrate to the new filthy and rapidly growing industrial cities, to Manchester, to Liverpool, to London. And there, they became the new industrial working class. They became the proletariat. The biographical agony that gave Marx's analysis such a ferocious power was that he lived in the very heart of this new world. He was a refugee in London, the capital of capitalism. And he saw this great stark division with his own eyes every single day. He saw the incredible wealth and power of the bourgeoisie, the world of the Crystal Palace, the world of bankers and factory owners and colonial administrators. And he lived in the world of the proletariat. He lived in the slums of Soho. He saw the child labor. He saw the 16-hour workdays. He saw the disease, the malnutrition, and the profound, soul-crushing misery that was the foundation of all that bourgeois wealth. His work was not an abstract theory, it was an attempt to give a scientific voice to the suffering that he saw all around him, and that he experienced in his own life. This new capitalist world, he argued, had a brutal, simplifying logic. Unlike previous eras, with their complex and overlapping social classes, capitalism relentlessly dissolves all the classes in the middle. The small artisan, the independent craftsman, the small shopkeeper, they cannot compete with the massive productive power of the industrial capitalist. They are, one by one, crushed by the competition. Their small property is lost, and they are forced to fall down into the ranks of the proletariat. Society, he argued, is inevitably and increasingly splitting into two great hostile camps. On one side, a tiny minority of immensely wealthy owners, the bourgeoisie. On the other, a vast and growing majority of propertyless workers, the proletariat. And this, for Marx, is why this class struggle is the final class struggle of human history. Previous revolutionary classes, like the bourgeoisie, were a minority overthrowing another minority. When they won, they simply established themselves as the new ruling class. But the proletariat is different. First, they are the vast majority of the population. And second, they are at the absolute bottom of the social pyramid. They have nothing. They are the class that has been stripped of everything but its own raw humanity. Therefore, their revolution cannot be a partial one. They cannot liberate themselves without liberating all of society from the very existence of class. They cannot take over the means of production for their own private benefit. They can only take it over and turn it into the common property of all. Their victory would not just be another rotation of the wheel of history, another case of a new ruling class replacing an old one. Their victory would be the act that breaks the wheel itself. It would be the end of the long, brutal, and bloody prehistory of humanity, and the beginning of a new, truly human history. And so, we arrive at the central, tragic, and for Marx, scientifically necessary irony of the modern age. The bourgeoisie, the most dynamic and revolutionary class in history, has performed a miracle. It has created a world of unprecedented wealth and technological power. But in the very act of its creation, it has also forged its own executioner. It has called into existence, like a sorcerer who can no longer control the powers he has summoned from the nether world, the one class that will inevitably rise up and destroy it. The greatest and most creative achievement of the bourgeoisie is the creation of its own grave diggers. This creation of the proletariat, this vast class of human beings who own nothing but their ability to work, is not just an economic event for Marx. It is a profound spiritual and psychological catastrophe. To understand the true human cost of capitalism, we must look beyond the balance sheets, beyond the theories of historical change, and into the very soul of the modern worker. We must explore Marx's most powerful, most humanistic, and most devastating critique of the system. We must understand his theory of alienation. The German word Marx used was Entfremdung. It means estrangement. It describes a state of being a stranger in your own life, of being disconnected from your own work, your own nature, and your fellow human beings. For Marx, alienation is not just a vague subjective feeling of sadness or loneliness. It is a real, structural, and objective condition that is built into the very DNA of the capitalist mode of production. To understand what has been lost, we must first look back at a pre-capitalist world. Imagine a medieval craftsman, a carpenter or a blacksmith. He owns his own small workshop. He owns his own tools. He controls his own work process, from beginning to end. He takes a piece of raw material, and through his own skill, his own sweat, his own creative vision, he transforms it into a finished product. A chair, a sword. That product is an expression of his own identity. When he looks at it, he sees a reflection of himself. His relationship to his work is direct, meaningful, and whole. Now, contrast this with the condition of the modern worker in the capitalist factory. Marx argues that this new system has systematically dismantled this meaningful relationship, creating a state of profound alienation that manifests in four distinct and tragic ways. The first is alienation from the product of labor. The worker in the factory spends his day producing a commodity, but this product does not belong to him. The moment it is created, it is taken away and becomes the property of the capitalist, who will sell it for a profit. The worker has no control over the fate of the thing he has created. He may work on an assembly line helping to produce a beautiful, sophisticated, and expensive smartphone, but he will likely never be able to afford the very object he has poured his life force into creating. This creates a perverse and deeply alienating relationship. The product of the worker's own labor becomes an alien, external, and even hostile object. The more the worker produces, the more wealth he creates, the more powerful the world of commodities becomes. And this world of commodities, this world of capital, stands over and against him as an alien power that dominates his life. He produces the very instruments of his own oppression. The more efficient he becomes, the more likely he is to be replaced by a machine. The more wealth he generates for the capitalist, the greater the power imbalance between them becomes. His own creativity is turned into a force that diminishes him. The second, and perhaps more immediate form, is alienation from the act of labor itself. The work process in the capitalist factory is not a fulfilling creative activity. It is, for Marx, forced labor. The worker does not do it because he wants to, but because he has no other choice if he wants to survive. He does not control the process. He does not decide what to make, or how to make it, or at what pace to work. He is subject to the tyranny of the clock and the relentless, inhuman rhythm of the machine. His work does not engage his full human potential, his intellect, his creativity, his imagination. It demands only a tiny, repetitive, and mindless fraction of his being. He becomes, in Marx's famous and brutal phrase, an appendage of the machine. This means that the time the worker spends at work is not his own life. It is time that he has sold to someone else. It is time that he has sold to someone else. It is a part of his life that has been sacrificed. Marx writes, with profound psychological insight, that the worker only feels himself outside his work, and in his work feels outside himself. He is at home when he is not working, and when he is working he is not at home. His true life, his human life, only begins when the factory whistle blows. His time at work is a kind of living death, a period of suspended animation that he must endure in order to earn the means to be truly alive for a few brief hours, in the evening and on the weekend. This leads to the third, and most philosophically profound, form of alienation. Alienation from our species being. The German term is Gattungswesen. By this, Marx means our essential human nature. What is it, he asks, that separates us from the animals? An animal produces, but it only produces what is immediately necessary for its own survival or the survival of its young. It builds a nest or a web, but it does so according to a fixed, instinctual pattern. Human beings are different. We are capable of free, conscious, and universal production. We can create things not just for our immediate needs, but according to the laws of beauty. We can build a cathedral. We can compose a symphony. We can write a poem. Our essential nature, our species being, is to be a free and creative producer. We see an idea in our mind, and we use our labor to transform the material world to match that idea. And in the object we create, we see a reflection of our own consciousness. This is the source of a deeply human satisfaction. It is the joy of the artist, of the craftsman, of the creator. Capitalist labor, Marx argues, is the complete and total inversion of this. It is a denial of our species being. Under capitalism, our free, conscious, creative activity is transformed into its opposite, a forced, unconscious, and dehumanizing chore. Our labor is no longer an end in itself, an expression of our own humanity. It is merely a means to an end, the earning of a wage to ensure our physical survival. We are reduced from the level of the artist to the level of the beast of burden. The very activity that should be the source of our greatest joy and our deepest sense of identity becomes the source of our misery and our self-estrangement. Finally, these three forms of alienation inevitably lead to a fourth: alienation from other human beings. If our work is a source of misery and competition, then our relationships with other people become poisoned. First, our relationship with the capitalist is not a human one. It is a purely instrumental and antagonistic one. The capitalist sees the worker not as a fellow human being, but as a cost of production, an instrument to be used as efficiently as possible to generate profit. And the worker sees the capitalist as the alien power that controls and exploits them. But alienation also infects the relationships between the workers themselves. The capitalist system forces workers to compete with each other for scarce jobs and wages. It turns them into rivals rather than comrades. The solidarity of the human community is replaced by the isolating competition of the marketplace. Ultimately, all of our social relationships come to be mediated through the cash nexus. We begin to see other people not in their full humanity, but in terms of their market value, their utility, their potential for our own profit or advancement. The biographical agony that fueled this powerful critique was Marx's own. While he was not a factory worker, he was an intellectual who was profoundly alienated from his own labor. As a radical writer, he was an outcast from the respectable academic and professional world. He could not get a university position. He was forced for much of his life to sell his immense intellectual labor to newspapers, often for pitiful wages, writing articles on subjects he cared little about, simply to put food on the table. He knew the feeling of having your creative power subordinated to the needs of the market. But more profoundly, his agony was that of the compassionate observer. His theory of alienation was not just a clever philosophical idea. It was his attempt to give a name to the immense human suffering he witnessed all around him in the slums of London, and that he read about in the cold, brutal, official government reports on the horrific conditions of the English working class. And so we arrive at the great tragic and central irony of the capitalist system, according to Marx. It is the most productive and wealthiest society in human history, a world overflowing with magnificent objects, technologies, and commodities. And yet, the human beings who create all of this wealth feel themselves to be impoverished, empty, and powerless. We have built a world that is a monument to our own collective genius, and we wander through it like strangers in a foreign land. The great tragedy of modern life is not that we are poor, but that in the midst of our own incredible riches, we have lost ourselves. This profound experience of alienation, This feeling of being a stranger in your own life is not just a feeling for Marx. It is not a mere psychological complaint that can be fixed with a change in attitude. It is the psychological symptom of a deep, structural, and objective economic reality. To understand the root cause of this modern agony, we must now move from Marx the humanist philosopher to Marx the scientist. We must descend into the hidden engine room of the capitalist system, into the complex and often mystifying world of commodities, of value, and of capital. We must answer the single great question that preoccupied him for decades, the central puzzle of his magnum opus, Das Kapital. Where does profit come from? This question, at first, seems simple, but for Marx, the common answers were all superficial and unsatisfying. A shopkeeper might say that he makes a profit by buying cheap and selling dear. But Marx, looking at the system as a whole, knew that this could not be the answer. If everyone is just trying to outsmart everyone else in the marketplace, that may move existing wealth around, but it does not create any new wealth. For every winner, there must be a loser. It's a zero-sum game. So, where does the new, additional value that constitutes profit actually come from? It cannot come from the raw materials used in production. A capitalist might buy a ton of cotton for $1,000. That cotton is worth $1,000. It cannot magically become worth more on its own. It cannot come from the machinery. A machine, over its lifetime, will transfer its own value to the products it creates as it wears down, a process we call depreciation. But it cannot create more value than it itself possesses. The capitalist begins the day with a sum of money. He uses it to buy his factory, his raw materials, and to hire his workers. At the end of the day, after selling the commodities that have been produced, he has his original investment back, plus an additional amount, a profit. This additional amount, the surplus, seems to appear out of thin air. It is a feat of magic that happens every day in every factory around the world. To solve this puzzle, Marx first had to understand the nature of value itself. He began with an idea he inherited from the great classical economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo, the labor theory of value. This theory states that the value of any commodity is determined by the average amount of human labor time that is socially necessary to produce it. A hand-carved table is more valuable than a simple wooden chair, not because of a subjective whim, but because it objectively requires more hours of socially necessary labor to produce. Value at its root is a crystallization of human labor. Armed with this theory, Marx returned to the marketplace. He saw that the capitalist, in his search for profit, must find one very special, almost magical, kind of commodity to buy. He must find a commodity whose very use, whose very consumption, has the unique and miraculous property of creating new value. And there is only one such commodity on the market. That commodity is the worker's own labor power. Labor power is a person's capacity to work, their mental and physical ability to perform labor for a certain period of time, a day, a week, a month. In a capitalist society, the proletarian, who owns nothing else, is forced to treat their own life force as a commodity and sell it on the market to the capitalist in exchange for a wage. Now, like any other commodity, labor power has a value. And its value is determined in the same way, by the amount of labor time necessary to produce it. What does it take to produce a worker? It takes the food, the shelter, the clothing, and the rest necessary to keep that worker alive and healthy enough to be able to show up for work again the next day. It also includes the cost of raising the next generation of workers. This total cost of keeping the worker alive and functioning is the true value of their labor power. And this, for Marx, is what the wage represents. The wage is the price the capitalist pays to buy the commodity of labor power for a specific period of time. And here, in this seemingly free and equal transaction, Marx uncovers the secret of profit. Let us walk through the process. Imagine a worker is hired for a 10-hour workday. The capitalist agrees to pay him a wage that is equal to the value of his labor power, the cost of his daily subsistence. The worker enters the factory. He begins to work. As he works, he is adding value to the raw materials. Let us say that after 4 hours of work, the worker has added enough new value to the commodities he is producing to equal the amount of his own daily wage. At this point, he has paid back the capitalist for the cost of hiring him. This is what Marx calls the necessary labor time. But the worker's contract is not for 4 hours, it is for 10. He does not get to go home after 4 hours. He must continue to work. And the next 6 hours of his workday are a completely different reality. The labor he performs during this time is surplus labor time. It is, from a Marxian perspective, unpaid labor. The value that he creates in these final 6 hours is surplus value. This surplus value, this wealth created by the worker for which he is not paid, belongs entirely to the capitalist. It is the single, hidden source of all profit, all rent, and all interest in the capitalist system. This is not, in a legal sense, a form of theft. The transaction was fair, according to the laws of the market. The capitalist paid the worker the full market value of his commodity, his labor power. But the secret of the system is that the value of the commodity of labor power and the value that this labor power can create in a full workday are two completely different things. And this difference is the source of all capitalist wealth. The system itself is built on a foundation of this structural and perfectly legal exploitation. The entire relentless drive of capitalism, Marx argues, is the drive to maximize the extraction of this surplus value. And there are two primary ways to do this. The first, and most brutal, is to increase what he called absolute surplus value. This is done by simply extending the length of the working day. If the capitalist can force the worker to work for 12 hours instead of 10 while keeping the wage the same, he has just secured 2 extra hours of unpaid surplus labor time for himself. This is why, Marx argues, the early history of capitalism was defined by a brutal and often bloody political struggle over the length of the working day. The great fight for the 10-hour day, and later the 8-hour day, was a direct class struggle over the rate of exploitation. The second and more sophisticated method is to increase what he called relative surplus value. This is done by increasing the productivity of labor. The capitalist invests in new technology, new machinery, new systems of organization. The purpose of this new machine is not to make the worker's life easier. The purpose is to make the worker so productive that he can produce the value equivalent to his own wage in less time. So, with the new machine, perhaps the worker now produces the value of his wage in only 2 hours, instead of 4. The workday might still be 10 hours long, but now the surplus labor time has increased from 6 hours to 8. The rate of exploitation has skyrocketed, without the capitalist having to engage in a politically difficult fight to extend the working day. This is why capitalism is a system of such constant, relentless technological revolution. Every new innovation, every new efficiency is a new tool for increasing the extraction of unpaid labor from the working class. The biographical agony that drove Marx to this incredible intellectual labor was his own profound sense of historical responsibility. For years, he sat in the British Museum, a solitary exile, surrounded by mountains of books. He meticulously studied obscure economic treatises, agricultural reports, and the horrifying official government documents, the Blue Books, which detailed the brutal conditions of the English working class. His agony was the crushing pressure to create a scientific proof for what he felt in his bones to be a profound moral outrage. He wasn't just doing economics. He was forging what he believed to be the scientific weapon that would arm the proletariat for their final historical revolution. The weight of this self-imposed mission defined his entire difficult life, and so Marx reveals the great hidden secret at the heart of the modern world. The contract between the worker and the capitalist, which appears on the surface to be a free and equal exchange, is a masterpiece of illusion. It is a transaction in which one party is paid for only a fraction of their day, and the other party is legally entitled to take the rest. Profit, the sacred lifeblood of the entire capitalist system, the engine of all its magnificent progress and innovation, is not created in the boardroom or the stock exchange. It is, and always must be, extracted from the unpaid labor, the stolen time, and the surplus life force of the working class. This scientific and brutal reality of surplus value, this hidden world of unpaid labor that lies at the heart of the capitalist system, is the great secret of modern production. But if this exploitation is so objective, so structural, so central to the entire system, why don't we see it? Why is it not obvious to everyone every single day? Why doesn't the entire system collapse under the weight of its own transparent injustice? Marx's answer to this is one of his most subtle, most strange, and most profoundly relevant ideas. He argued that the capitalist system has developed a powerful and sophisticated form of magic, a kind of social illusion, a collective hallucination that automatically hides the true nature of our social relationships from us. He called this modern black magic the fetishism of commodities. To understand this difficult but essential concept, we must begin with a simple object, the fundamental building block of the entire capitalist world, the commodity. A commodity, Marx explains, is a very queer thing, abounding in metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. On one hand, a commodity is a simple, physical object with a use value. A coat has the use value of keeping us warm. A loaf of bread has the use value of feeding us. This is straightforward and easy to understand. But in a market society, this simple object takes on a second, mysterious quality. It acquires an exchange value. It acquires a price. Suddenly, this coat is not just a coat, it is worth the same as 20 loaves of bread, or a certain amount of gold, or a specific number of dollars. And here, the mystery begins. Where does this exchange value come from? It seems to be an intrinsic, almost magical property of the object itself. This is the great illusion. Marx argues that the value of a commodity is not a natural property, like its weight or its color. It is a purely social property. It is, as we have learned, a reflection of the human labor that has been crystallized within it. But in a market society, we don't see that. The social reality of human labor is hidden, and in its place we see what looks like a natural, objective relationship between things. This is the process of mystification. To understand how it works, let's contrast our world with a pre-capitalist one. In a feudal society, the social relationships of production were direct, personal, and brutally transparent. The serf knew exactly who he was working for. He performed his labor on the lord's land, and the lord took a portion of his produce. The relationship of exploitation was a personal and visible one. There was no mystery. Now consider our modern capitalist world. We no longer live in a world of direct personal relationships of production. Our relationships are mediated by an anonymous, impersonal force, the market. A worker in a factory does not have a direct personal relationship with the millions of people who will eventually buy the products she helps to create. And when we, as consumers, buy a product, we have no relationship with the people who made it. We have a relationship only with its price. The market acts as a great, anonymous veil. It hides the real, social, human relationships that lie behind the production of our goods. And because these human relationships are hidden, the only thing we see are the relationships between the products themselves. It appears to us as if the commodities themselves are the ones who are relating to each other in the marketplace, that they have their own secret life, their own intrinsic values. This is the essence of fetishism. The word fetish, in its original, anthropological sense, refers to the practice in some tribal societies of worshipping an inanimate object, a carved stone, a piece of wood, as if it possessed a magical or divine power. Marx argues that our modern, secular, and supposedly rational society is in fact more fetishistic than any ancient tribe. We have simply transferred our worship from carved idols to the commodities we produce. We treat our own creations as if they were autonomous, powerful, and mysterious beings that rule over our lives. Let us take the most iconic commodity of the 21st century, the smartphone. This is the fetishized appearance. What you do not see is the reality. You do not see the Congolese miners, often children, who have dug the cobalt out of the earth in horrific conditions to make its battery. You do not see the factory workers in China, living in crowded dormitories, working brutally long hours, who have assembled its intricate components. You do not see the global network of engineers, of marketers, of shippers, of retail employees, a vast, complex, and often deeply exploitative web of human social relationships that are all crystallized in this single smooth object. The market has erased all of that. It has wiped away the sweat, the suffering, and the human labor, and it has presented us with a clean, magical fetish. The social character of our own labor appears to us as a natural, objective character of the products themselves. This fetishism extends beyond individual products to the market itself. We talk about the stock market as if it were a living, breathing, and temperamental god. We say, the market is nervous today. The market reacted positively to the news. We must do what we can to reassure the markets. What is this market that we speak of with such reverence? It is nothing but the sum total of our own collective, human economic activity. It is our own creation, but we have fetishized it. We have taken our own collective power, projected it onto an external abstract entity, and we now bow down before it as if it were an independent force of nature, a god whose mysterious whims determine our collective fate. This is the ultimate form of modern alienation. We are ruled by our own creation. This process is the direct social consequence of the alienation of labor. Because the worker is estranged from his own product, that product can return to him in the marketplace as an alien, powerful, and seemingly magical object. The biographical agony that fueled Marx's critique was that of a supreme rationalist living in a world that he saw as dangerously and profoundly irrational. He was a child of the Enlightenment. He believed in the power of reason to demystify the world, to tear down the old superstitions, to expose the hidden workings of power. And yet, when he looked at modern capitalism, he saw a system that was, in its own way, more mystical and more enchanted than the feudal, religious world it had replaced. His agony was the frustration of seeing humanity being enslaved by its own self-created illusions. He saw that the great promise of the Enlightenment to create a world governed by reason had failed. Instead, we had created a world governed by the irrational, phantom-like movements of commodities and capital. His entire life's work, the immense, solitary labor of writing Das Kapital, was an attempt to perform a great act of social exorcism. It was an attempt to break the spell, to demystify the world, to show us that the forces that rule our lives are not mysterious, godlike powers. They are the products of our own social relationships, and what we have made, we can also unmake. And so we arrive at the final and most haunting of Marx's critiques of the system. He shows us that capitalism, the great historical project of secularism, of science, of rational calculation, did not disenchant the world. It re-enchanted it in a new and far more dangerous way. We have cast out the old gods of the heavens and the earth, only to fall down and worship the new, faceless and impersonal gods of the marketplace. The great irony of our materialist age is that we are ruled, more completely than any society before us, by the invisible, mystical, and tyrannical power of the very things we have made. This enchanted world of the commodity fetish, this modern religion of the market that hides our own social relationships from us, presents itself as a natural, stable, and eternal system. But for Marx, this was the ultimate illusion. Beneath the mystical surface of the marketplace, he saw that the capitalist system was not a stable order at all. It was a chaos of violent, relentless, and ultimately self-destructive contradictions. He did not believe that capitalism would be overthrown simply because it was immoral or unjust. He believed it would be overthrown because it was fundamentally irrational and unsustainable. To understand this, we must understand that the driving force of the entire system is not the satisfaction of human needs. The goal is not to produce useful things for people. The single, all-consuming, and non-negotiable goal of the capitalist system is the endless accumulation of profit. And this single-minded obsession, Marx argued, creates a series of profound and insoluble contradictions that will inevitably lead to the system's collapse. The first and most obvious of these is the crisis of overproduction. This is one of the great, absurd ironies of the modern world. In all previous historical eras, economic crises were caused by scarcity. A famine, a drought, a plague. A crisis meant there was not enough of something. How does this happen? The capitalist system is fundamentally anarchic. It is not a planned economy. Each individual capitalist, in a state of vicious competition with every other, is driven to produce as much as possible, as efficiently as possible, to capture a larger share of the market. This leads to an incredible, almost miraculous expansion of productive power. But it also leads to a fundamental problem. The same system that is so brilliant at producing goods is also, by its very nature, a system that suppresses the wages of the workers who must buy those goods. The result is a periodic crisis of overproduction. The market becomes saturated with commodities that cannot be sold at a profit. A glut occurs. And what happens then? Prices collapse. To cut their losses, capitalists shut down their factories. They lay off their workers. The laid-off workers now have even less money to buy goods, which makes the crisis even worse. This is the absurd spectacle of a capitalist recession. We have warehouses full of food while people are going hungry. We have millions of empty houses while people are homeless. We have factories sitting idle while millions of people are unemployed and desperate for work. The system's own incredible productivity becomes a curse. It grinds to a halt, not because of a failure, but because of its own runaway success. It is, in Marx's view, like a sorcerer who has summoned powers he can no longer control and is now drowning in the very abundance he has created. The system eventually recovers, after a painful period of bankruptcies and consolidation, and the cycle begins all over again. But each crisis, Marx believed, would become more severe, more global, and more damaging than the last. But this is just the most visible contradiction. Marx believed he had discovered a deeper, more secret, and more fundamental law that was driving the system towards its ultimate doom. This is his famous and notoriously difficult theory of the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. To understand this, we must remember that for Marx, the only source of new value, of surplus value, is the exploitation of living human labor. The capitalist's investment, his capital, can be divided into two parts. First, there is constant capital. This is the money spent on the means of production, the machinery, the raw materials, the factory itself. These things are constant because they can only transfer their own existing value to the final product. A machine that is worth $1,000 can, over its lifetime, add only $1,000 of value to the commodities it helps produce. It cannot create new value. Second, there is variable capital. This is the money spent on buying labor power, on wages. This is variable because it is the only part of the investment that can produce a value greater than its own. The capitalist pays the worker a wage, but the worker, in their full day of labor, produces a surplus value over and above that wage. This is the source of all profit. Now, what is the relentless competitive logic of capitalism? Every capitalist is in a life-or-death struggle with every other capitalist. To survive, they must become more efficient. They must produce their goods more cheaply than their rivals. And the primary way to do this is to invest in new, labor-saving technology. The capitalist who introduces a new machine can produce more goods with fewer workers or in less time. This allows him to undercut his competitors and capture a larger share of the market. This means that over the long course of capitalist development, there is an iron law. The ratio of constant capital to variable capital will constantly increase. The system will be composed of more and more dead labor, machinery, and relatively less and less living labor, human workers. And here, for Marx, is the Achilles heel of the entire system. Remember, only living labor, only the variable part of the capital, can create surplus value, which is the source of profit. If the total pool of investment is shifting more and more towards machinery, and less towards the one thing that actually generates profit, then the overall rate of profit for the system as a whole must, over the long term, have a tendency to fall. This creates a state of permanent, frantic desperation for the capitalist class. It drives them to ever more extreme measures to counteract this tendency, to increase the rate of exploitation, to find new markets, to engage in risky financial speculation. But it is a battle they are destined to lose. These crises, in turn, accelerate another of the system's great contradictions, the concentration and centralization of capital. The competitive jungle of the marketplace is not a level playing field. One capitalist always kills many, Marx wrote. During the periodic crises of overproduction, the smaller, weaker capitalists are the first to go bankrupt. Their factories and their assets are then bought up, for pennies on the dollar, by the larger, stronger capitalists who survive the crash. The relentless logic of the system is towards monopoly. Wealth becomes concentrated in fewer and fewer hands. The small middle class of independent shopkeepers and artisans is crushed and pushed down into the ranks of the proletariat. And this leads to the final, the greatest, and the most beautiful of all of capitalism's contradictions. The very process of its own development creates the agent of its own destruction. The system, by its own internal logic, produces its own gravediggers. How? To function, to run its massive factories, To operate its complex division of labor, capitalism must, by necessity, do several things. First, it must pull millions of workers from the isolation of their rural villages and concentrate them together in massive industrial cities. Second, in the factory itself, it must discipline and organize these workers into a vast, cooperative, and highly efficient collective army of labor. Third, by creating a global market and new forms of communication, like the railway and the telegraph, it allows these concentrated and organized workers to communicate with each other, to recognize their shared condition, and to form their own institutions, like trade unions. The biographical agony of Marx was that he was not just a detached, academic observer of this process. He was a prophet, living in the heart of the storm. His years of solitary, obsessive labor in the British Museum were his attempt to give a scientific, irrefutable proof to the revolutionary hope that sustained him through a life of poverty and exile. He believed he was not just writing a book, he was charting the inevitable, scientific laws of history. He saw the immense human suffering caused by the crises of capitalism not as a random tragedy, but as the necessary and predictable birth pangs of a new world. His work was his attempt to act as the midwife for that new world, to provide the revolutionary class with the theoretical weapons it would need for the final struggle. And so, in Marx's grand and terrible vision, capitalism is revealed to be a tragic, almost Oedipal figure. In its relentless and brilliant quest for power and profit, it is unknowingly creating the very forces that will lead to its own destruction. Every new factory it builds is a barracks for its future army. Every new technology it invents is a weapon that will one day be turned against it. Capitalism is not a system that will be murdered by an external enemy. It is a system that, with the flawless and inescapable logic of a Greek tragedy, is committing suicide. This grand scientific and seemingly impersonal theory of capitalism's inevitable self-destruction was never, for Marx, enough. He was not just a scientist, sitting in a library, calmly observing the laws of history as if they were the laws of planetary motion. He was a revolutionary. He knew that for the revolution to happen, for history to be pushed forward, the proletariat needed more than a dense 3-volume economic treatise. It needed a weapon. It needed a story, a prophecy, a declaration of war, and a call to arms. It needed a manifesto. In the winter of 1847, as a new wave of revolutionary fervor was beginning to simmer across Europe, a small, obscure group of radical German exiles called the Communist League held a congress in London. They commissioned 2 of their members, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, to write a definitive platform for their movement. The document they produced, written in a feverish rush over the next few weeks, was destined to become the most famous, most influential, and most explosive political pamphlet ever written. It was originally titled the Manifesto of the Communist Party. To read the Manifesto is to encounter Marx not as a scientist, but as a prophet. It is not a dry academic text, it is a masterpiece of political rhetoric, a work of literature that is by turns analytical, lyrical, savage, and visionary. Its power lies not just in its ideas, but in its unforgettable, almost biblical, prose. It begins with one of the most famous opening lines in the history of political thought. A specter is haunting Europe, the specter of communism. This is an act of rhetorical genius. Marx and Engels do not begin defensively, as the leaders of a small marginal group. They begin from a position of immense and terrifying power. They take the paranoid fears of their enemies, the Pope, the Tsar, the conservative statesmen of Europe, and they embrace them. They accept the label of the specter, the ghost, the demon that is haunting the dreams of the old order. They are announcing that they are not just a political party, they are a historical inevitability, a ghost from the future that has come to claim its inheritance. Having established this tone of world historical importance, the first section of the Manifesto proceeds to lay out their entire theory of history in a few breathtakingly powerful pages. This section, titled Bourgeois and Proletarians, is the grand sweeping drama we have already explored, now condensed into its most potent and electrifying form. It is here that Marx writes, with a kind of dark admiration, of the revolutionary role of the bourgeoisie. He describes how they have put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations, how they have left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, and how they have, for the first time in history, disclosed what man's activity can bring about. This is not the work of a man who does not understand his enemy. It is the work of a man who understands that the very system he is trying to destroy is the most dynamic and productive in human history. But this creative power, the Manifesto argues, has unleashed a destructive logic it can no longer control. The bourgeoisie has created a world after its own image, and in doing so, it has created its own great antagonist, the modern working class, the proletariat. This first section lays out the great dialectical drama of history, presenting the coming conflict not as a possibility, but as a scientific certainty. The second section then asks the crucial question, what do the communists, the vanguard of this rising proletariat, actually want? It is here that the Manifesto lays out its famous and profoundly controversial program. Marx and Engels systematically address the terrified accusations of their bourgeois critics. The central charge, of course, is the most terrifying of all, that the communists desire to abolish private property. Marx does not shy away from this. He embraces it. But he also, crucially, defines what he means. He argues that the communists have no intention of abolishing the personal property of the small artisan or the peasant, the property that is the fruit of a man's own labor. That kind of property, he says, is already being destroyed every day by capitalism itself. The property that must be abolished is bourgeois private property. This is not your personal belongings, your clothes, your books, your home. Bourgeois private property is the private ownership of the means of production. It is the ownership of capital, of the factories and the land, the kind of property that allows one class to exploit the labor of another. To abolish this, he argues, is not to take something away from the vast majority of people, because 90% of the population already has no such property. It is simply to prevent a tiny minority from using their ownership of the world's productive forces to enslave the majority. Having made this central point, the Manifesto then lays out a 10-point program of transitional demands. These are the measures that the proletariat, after seizing power, would implement to begin the transition to a communist society. For us, today, some of these demands may seem commonplace. A progressive income tax, free public education for all children. But in the context of the brutal, laissez-faire capitalism of 1848, they were a declaration of war on the entire bourgeois order. The program includes the abolition of all rights of inheritance, the centralization of credit in the hands of the state by means of a national bank, the centralization of the means of communication and transport in the hands of the state. This is the program for the complete and total dismantling of the old world. The biographical agony that hangs over the Communist Manifesto is the agony of a prophecy that seemed to come true, but not in the way its authors had hoped. Marx and Engels wrote this document in a frantic rush in the early weeks of 1848, believing they were on the very cusp of a great pan-European proletarian revolution. And just as the Manifesto was coming off the presses, Europe did indeed explode. Revolutions broke out in France, in Germany, in Italy, in the Austrian Empire. It was the springtime of the peoples. But this was not the revolution that Marx had been waiting for. These were largely liberal, bourgeois revolutions, not proletarian ones. And they were, one by one, brutally and systematically crushed. The failure of the 1848 revolutions was a profound and bitter disappointment for Marx. It was the moment he realized that history moved more slowly, more brutally, and more unpredictably than his scientific theory had perhaps accounted for. He had provided the script for the great historical drama, but the actors, the proletariat, were not yet conscious of their role. They were not yet ready to take the stage. This disappointment would force him into the long, solitary, and difficult intellectual labor of his London exile, the decades of scientific research that would produce Das Kapital. But the Manifesto remains his most powerful and enduring work, precisely because it is not a scientific text. It is a work of prophetic art, and it ends with one of the most powerful and unforgettable calls to action ever penned. After dismissing the criticisms of his opponents, Marx turns, for the last time, to address the workers of the world. He declares that in this coming revolution, the proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. And then the final, immortal words. Working men of all countries, unite. And so we are left with the great paradox of the Communist Manifesto. It is a document that claims to be a cold, hard, scientific analysis of the impersonal laws of history. Yet it is written with the fire, the passion, and the moral fury of a biblical prophecy. It is a text that predicts the inevitable and deterministic collapse of a system. And yet it ends with the most personal, most urgent, and most powerful call to human action ever written. The book that sought to explain the end of history became, for the next century and a half, the single most powerful force in the making of it. This final electrifying call to action, "Working men of all countries, unite," was not for Marx a mere hopeful slogan. It was not a romantic, utopian dream. It was the conscious expression of what he believed to be a cold, hard, and scientific law of history. He believed that the proletarian revolution was not just a moral desirability, something that should happen. He believed it was a historical inevitability, something that must happen. This claim to scientific certainty is what separated Marx from all the utopian socialists who came before him. They had dreamed of a better world. Marx claimed to have discovered the objective, economic laws that were making that better world a certainty. He saw himself not as a prophet but as a scientist. He was not predicting the future based on a mystical vision. He believed he was predicting it in the same way an astronomer predicts an eclipse, by understanding the underlying laws of motion of the system. This claim to scientific prophecy is what gave Marxism its immense and often terrifying power. It was not just another political opinion, it was, its followers believed, the voice of history itself. So, what was the basis for this incredible certainty? What was the flawless internal logic that, for Marx, guaranteed that the capitalist system was doomed? His argument is a grand synthesis of all the contradictions we have been exploring. First, as we have seen, are the inescapable economic contradictions. The system is prone to ever more severe crises of overproduction. This boom and bust cycle is not an accident. It is the natural, chaotic heartbeat of a sick system. Each crisis, Marx argued, acts like a great earthquake. It weakens the entire structure. It drives smaller capitalists into bankruptcy, accelerates the concentration of wealth in fewer and fewer hands, and throws millions of workers out of their jobs, reminding them of the profound insecurity of their own existence. The crises reveal the fundamental irrationality of the system. A world where people starve because there is too much food, where people are homeless because there are too many houses, is a world that is, in his view, demonstrably insane. These periodic collapses were the proof that the system's relations of production were no longer compatible with its immense forces of production. The machine had become too powerful for its own social casing. Beneath this cyclical crisis, there was the long-term terminal illness, the tendency of the rate of profit to fall. This creates a state of permanent desperation for the ruling class, driving them to more frantic forms of exploitation, to more risky financial speculation, and to more aggressive colonial expansion in the search for new markets and cheaper labor. The system, in its old age, becomes more and more frantic, more and more destructive, as it fights against its own internal law of decay. These economic contradictions then create the social contradictions that will provide the human army for the final revolution. The system's own logic, as we have seen, relentlessly simplifies the class structure. The middle classes, the small shopkeepers, the independent artisans, are crushed by the competition of the great industrial capitalists. They are pushed down into the ranks of the proletariat. Society becomes increasingly and visibly polarized into two great, hostile camps. At the top, a tiny oligarchy of the super-rich, the bourgeoisie, who control all the wealth and power, and at the bottom, a vast and ever-growing majority of wage laborers, the proletariat, who own nothing. The battle lines become starkly and brutally clear. But this on its own is still not enough. A vast, impoverished and suffering population is not necessarily a revolutionary one. For the revolution to happen, this mass of people must move from being just a collection of suffering individuals to becoming a unified, self-conscious, and revolutionary force. And this, for Marx, was the final and most brilliant part of the dialectical process. The capitalist system itself, in the very act of exploiting the proletariat, unintentionally forges it into the perfect revolutionary subject. He described this as the movement of the proletariat from being a class in itself to becoming a class for itself. A class in itself is a purely objective, economic category. It is a group of people who share the same relationship to the means of production, but who are not yet aware of their shared identity or their collective power. They are a sack of potatoes, as Marx once wrote, a collection of individual units, not a unified force. The great drama of capitalism is the process by which this class in itself becomes a class for itself. This transformation happens in a series of stages. First, capitalism performs the great act of concentration. It pulls the workers out of their isolated villages and concentrates them by the thousands and tens of thousands in the great industrial cities and in the even greater industrial factories. For the first time in history, the exploited class is not a scattered peasantry, but a concentrated mass, living and working side by side. Second, in the shared hell of the factory, they begin to develop a sense of solidarity. They are all subject to the same long hours, the same low wages, the same brutal discipline of the machine. Their individual suffering begins to merge into a collective grievance. Third, they begin to organize. They form trade unions. At first, these are just local, defensive organizations, designed to fight for a few more pennies on their wage, or a few less hours in their workday. This is the beginning of the economic class struggle. But through these struggles, they learn a crucial lesson. They learn that their enemy is not just their own individual boss. Their enemy is the entire capitalist class, which is backed up by the power of the state, with its police, its courts, and its law. And this leads to the final decisive stage, the achievement of political consciousness. The workers realize that their struggle is not just an economic one. It must become a political one. They form their own political parties. They move from fighting for a fair day's wage to fighting for the abolition of the wage system itself. At this moment, the proletariat ceases to be a sack of potatoes. It has become a self-conscious, organized, and revolutionary army. It has become a class for itself. And what is the nature of the revolution it will wage? Marx was not a utopian dreamer. He was a hard-headed realist. He did not believe that the bourgeoisie, the ruling class that controlled the state, the military, and all the wealth of society, would simply step aside and peacefully surrender its power. He believed that, in most cases, the revolution would have to be a violent one. He saw force as the midwife of every old society, pregnant with a new one. The transition from one social order to another was, for him, like a birth. And birth is a violent, painful, and bloody process. The biographical agony of Karl Marx was the profound and lifelong tension between his scientific theory of inevitability and his own passionate, relentless, and often frustrating life as a political agitator. If the revolution is a scientific certainty, then why work so hard to make it happen? Why spend your life in poverty and exile, organizing meetings, writing pamphlets, and desperately trying to stoke the fires of revolt? This is the central paradox of his own existence. He was the great prophet of a future that was guaranteed to arrive, and his life was one of constant, frustrated waiting. He expected the revolution to break out in his own lifetime, after the great economic crises of the 1850s and 60s. He dedicated himself to building the First International, an organization of working-class parties to prepare the proletariat for its historical mission. But history did not move on his schedule. His agony was that of a scientist whose grand experiment was not proceeding as predicted. It was the agony of a prophet who could see the promised land, but who was destined to die in the wilderness, never reaching it himself. And so we are left with the great and driving paradox of the Marxist revolutionary. He is a figure who is armed with the absolute scientific certainty that history is on his side, that the victory of his class is guaranteed by the impersonal laws of economics. And yet, this very certainty does not lead him to passive waiting. It fills him with a burning, almost religious sense of duty to act, to struggle, to conspire, to sacrifice everything in order to become the willing and conscious agent of that very inevitability. The belief that the future is already written is the very thing that gives him the strength to pick up a pen and a sword, to write it himself. This inevitable revolution, this great and final act in the drama of human history, is not the end of the story for Marx. It is the beginning of a new, difficult, and dangerous chapter. What happens the day after the revolution? After the barricades have come down, after the old bourgeois state has been shattered, after the proletariat has seized power, what comes next? How is the new world to be built from the rubble of the old? Marx's answer to this question is his most controversial, his most politically charged, and his most tragically misinterpreted concept. It is the idea that would be used in the 20th century to justify the creation of some of the most oppressive and murderous regimes in human history. It is the theory of the dictatorship of the proletariat. To understand this concept, we must begin by performing a crucial act of historical and linguistic hygiene. We must scrape away the thick, blood-caked layers of 20th century history that have come to encrust the word dictatorship. When we hear that word today, we think of a single tyrannical individual, a Stalin, a Hitler, a Mao. We think of a totalitarian state, of secret police, of concentration camps, of the total suppression of all freedom. For Marx, writing in the 19th century, the word dictatorship had a more specific and technical meaning. He did not mean the rule of a single person or a small, conspiratorial party. He meant the dictatorship of an entire class. To understand this, we must first understand Marx's theory of the state itself. For Marx, the state, with its laws, its police, its courts, its army, is never a neutral arbiter, standing above society and dispensing impartial justice. The state, he argued, is always and everywhere an instrument of class oppression. It is a weapon. It is the executive committee of the ruling class, an organization whose primary purpose is to protect the property relations of the dominant class, and to manage the affairs of that class. Therefore, for Marx, every state is a dictatorship of the class that rules it. The slave-owning society of ancient Rome was a dictatorship of the masters over the slaves. The feudal kingdom of the Middle Ages was a dictatorship of the landed aristocracy over the serf. And the modern, liberal, democratic republic of his own time, with its talk of freedom and human rights, was for him no different. Beneath the velvet glove of democratic procedure, he saw the iron fist of class rule. He argued that a modern democracy, with its powerful corporate lobbies, its politicians funded by the wealthy, its legal system designed to protect private property above all else, and its police force ready to crush any serious challenge to that system, is in reality a dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. It is a system in which the vast working majority is ruled by a tiny minority of property owners. Seen from this perspective, the dictatorship of the proletariat is not a move away from democracy. For Marx, it is the first truly democratic act in human history. It is the moment when the immense majority of the population, the working class, seizes control of the state for the first time. It is the dictatorship of the many over the few, of the formerly oppressed over the former oppressors. So, what is the purpose of this new workers' state? What is its historical task? Its work is twofold. It is both destructive and constructive. First, it has a repressive function. Marx was a hard-headed realist. He did not believe that the defeated bourgeoisie, a class that still possessed immense wealth, international connections, and centuries of experience in ruling, would simply accept its fate and disappear. He knew they would fight back. He expected a period of intense, violent, and prolonged civil war, as the old ruling class would do everything in its power to sabotage the revolution and to reclaim its lost property and privilege. The primary and most urgent task of the dictatorship of the proletariat, therefore, is to defend the revolution. It must use the full power of the state, its army, its police, its laws, to violently suppress this inevitable bourgeois counter-revolution. This is the dictatorial aspect of the theory in the sense that we would recognize. It is the state as a weapon of class warfare. The biographical agony that informed this hard-headed and unsentimental view was Marx's own direct experience of the brutal power of the state. He had been hounded by the Prussian secret police his entire adult life. He had been exiled again and again. And most importantly, he had witnessed the tragic fate of the Paris Commune of In the Commune, for the first time in history, the working class of a major European city had seized power for itself. For a few brief, glorious months, they had created a radical, democratic, and self-governing workers' state. And Marx had watched, from his exile in London, as the combined forces of the French and Prussian states had descended upon the city and brutally crushed the Commune, massacring tens of thousands of men, women, and children in the streets. He learned a bitter lesson from this. He believed the communards had been too gentle, too disorganized, too unwilling to use the full, ruthless power of the state to defend their revolution. His theory of the dictatorship of the proletariat was his answer. The working class, he concluded, could not afford to be naive. To win, it had to be just as organized, just as disciplined, and just as ruthless as its enemies. But this repressive function is only the first and most negative task of the new state. Its second and more important task is a constructive one. It is to begin the great economic transformation of society. The workers' state must use its new power to systematically dismantle the entire economic foundation of the old bourgeois world. This is the practical implementation of the program first laid out in the Communist Manifesto. The state will seize the means of production from the hands of the bourgeoisie. It will nationalize the banks, the factories, the mines, the land, and the transportation networks. It will place the entire productive apparatus of society under the collective, democratic control of the working class itself. It will abolish the right of inheritance. It will implement a steeply progressive income tax. It will create a system of free, universal public education. Its goal is to systematically eliminate the very concept of private, bourgeois property and to replace it with a new system of social ownership, to replace the anarchic logic of the market with the rational planning of production for human need. This is the great, difficult, and transitional period that Marx called socialism. But even this is not the final goal, and this leads us to the most radical, most utopian, and most important part of the entire theory. This workers' state, this dictatorship of the proletariat, is not a permanent institution. It is a temporary tool, a necessary evil, designed for a specific historical task. Marx, and especially his collaborator Engels, believed that the state itself was not a natural or eternal feature of human society. The state, they argued, is an instrument that arises only at a certain stage of historical development, the moment that society splits into antagonistic classes. The state is a machine that one class uses to hold another class in subjection. Therefore, in a future, fully developed communist society, where class distinctions have been completely and totally abolished, the very reason for the state's existence will have disappeared. In a classless society, there is no one left to oppress. And so, the state will not be abolished in a single violent act. It will, in Engels's famous and beautiful phrase, wither away. The government of persons, he wrote, is replaced by the administration of things. The state, as a repressive, coercive apparatus of power, will simply become obsolete, a relic to be placed in a museum of antiquities alongside the spinning wheel and the bronze axe. And here we arrive at the great, dangerous, and ultimately tragic paradox at the heart of the Marxist political project. The path to a future of perfect freedom, to a stateless, classless, and fully human utopia, leads directly through a period of total and uncompromising state power. To finally abolish the state as an instrument of oppression, the revolution must first seize it and create the most powerful and most centralized state in history. The dream of a world without chains is to be realized by first chaining the old masters. And the great unanswered question that would haunt the 20th century, the question that is the tragic legacy of Marx himself, is this: what happens when the new masters, having seized this total power for themselves, refuse to let it go? This dangerous and difficult transitional phase, the dictatorship of the proletariat, with all its potential for violence and repression, was never, for Marx, the final goal. But what is this new world? What is the final, utopian vision that lies at the end of the long, bloody road of human history? What is the society that will emerge after the final revolution, after the state has withered away? This is Marx's vision of communism. Now, we must begin with a profound and deliberate act of intellectual caution. Karl Marx was famously and intentionally vague about the specific details of a future communist society. He was not a utopian novelist. He was, in his own view, a scientist. His great life's work was the scientific analysis of the capitalist system as it actually existed. He refused to write recipes for the cookshops of the future. To do so, he believed, would be to abandon the rigor of his materialist science and to retreat into the kind of idealistic, fantasy-based speculation that he despised in the utopian socialists who came before him. He believed that the specific form of a future communist society would not be designed in advance by a philosopher in a library. It would be created by the free, conscious, and collective actions of the liberated proletariat itself. Therefore, to understand his vision of communism, we cannot look for a detailed blueprint. Instead, we must understand it as a negative image. We must define it by what it is not. Communism, for Marx, is the definitive and total overcoming of the structural conditions of capitalism that produce exploitation, class conflict, and alienation. If capitalism is defined by alienation, then communism is the society of radical, unalienated life. Let us explore what this means by revisiting the four forms of alienation we have discussed. First, communism is the overcoming of alienation from the product of our labor. In a communist society, the means of production, the factories, the land, the technology, are no longer the private property of a single class. They are owned in common by all of society. This means that the products of our collective labor also belong to all of us. They no longer return to us in the marketplace as alien, hostile commodities that dominate our lives. Instead, they are the transparent expression of our shared, social power to be distributed rationally according to human need. Second, communism is the overcoming of alienation from the act of labor. With the abolition of the wage system and the coercive need to sell our labor power simply to survive, the very nature of work itself is transformed. Work ceases to be a miserable, forced necessity. It becomes, in Marx's famous and beautiful phrase, life's prime want. It becomes a free, creative, and joyful activity. It is the expression of our own human nature. Something we want to do, not something we have to do. The old rigid division between work and life dissolves. Third, and most profoundly, communism is the overcoming of alienation from our species being. In this new world, humanity finally realizes its true, essential nature as a free and conscious creator. Our labor is no longer a dehumanizing chore that reduces us to the level of an animal. It is an artistic and scientific activity through which we transform the world and in doing so, transform ourselves. We finally overcome the contradiction between our individual existence and our collective, social essence. We become truly and fully human for the first time in history. And finally, communism is the overcoming of alienation from other human beings. With the abolition of class distinctions, the fundamental source of social conflict is eliminated. With the abolition of private property, the competition that turns us all into rivals is replaced by a spirit of cooperation. Human relationships are no longer mediated by the icy water of egotistical calculation and the callous cash nexus. They become transparent, direct, and based on mutual respect and genuine human connection. But Marx's vision went even further than this. He believed that communism would overcome one of the most ancient and psychologically crippling features of all previous civilizations, the division of labor. In all class societies, the individual is mutilated. We are forced into a single, specialized, and often monotonous role for our entire lives. A man is a factory worker, or a farmer, or a shoemaker, or a philosopher. This specialization, while economically productive, is psychologically destructive. It develops one small part of our being at the expense of all the others. It turns us into detail workers, into fragments of a human being. In his early, more humanistic writings, Marx sketched a radical vision of a society that would overcome this mutilation. In a communist society, he wrote, where the means of production are controlled by all, nobody has one exclusive sphere of activity. Each person can develop their talents in any branch they wish. Society regulates the general production and thus makes it possible for me to do one thing today and another tomorrow. To hunt in the morning, fish in the afternoon, rear cattle in the evening, criticize after dinner, just as I have a mind, without ever becoming hunter, fisherman, herdsman, or critic. This is a vision of the total man, the well-rounded individual who is free to develop all of their creative and intellectual capacities. The biographical agony that fueled this utopian dream was Marx's own profound and personal experience of the opposite. His vision of a world without material want was written by a man whose own children were dying of malnutrition. His dream of a society of free, creative activity was conceived by a man who was forced to spend decades of his life in the soul-crushing drudgery of economic research in the British Museum, and in the hack work of journalism just to keep his family from starving. His vision of a world without alienation was written by a man who was the ultimate alien, a stateless, political exile, a man without a home. This agony gives his vision its immense power. It is not the easy, detached dream of a comfortable utopian. It is the desperate, passionate, and necessary hope of a man who has looked into the very depths of human suffering and believes, with every fiber of his being, that another, better world is not only possible, but is a historical certainty. In one of his later and most important texts, The Critique of the Gotha Program, Marx gave his most detailed sketch of this future. He argued that communist society would arrive in two phases. The first, or lower phase of communism, what would later be called socialism, is the society that has just emerged from the womb of capitalism. It has abolished private ownership of the means of production, but it is still stamped with the birthmarks of the old society. In this phase, a certain inequality still exists. The principle of distribution is, from each according to his ability, to each according to his work. A person who is stronger, or more talented, or who works longer hours, will still receive more than a person who is weaker or less able. As the forces of production develop to an unprecedented degree, as the old, selfish consciousness of bourgeois society fades away, as the division of labor is overcome, humanity will finally be able to enter the higher phase of communist society. And in this higher phase, a new and final principle of justice will prevail. Society will inscribe on its banners the ultimate utopian motto, from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. This is the final vision. A world of such superabundance and such highly developed human consciousness that the very concept of exchange is overcome. You contribute what you can, and you take what you need. It is the final end of all economic calculation. And it is in this world, a world with no classes, no private property, and no scarcity, that the state itself, as an instrument of oppression, will finally become unnecessary and wither away. He presents us with a vision of a future that is as radical, as total, and as seemingly unattainable as any religious paradise. He called his entire analysis of the past the story of human prehistory. The true, authentic story of humanity, he believed, could only begin after the final revolution. The end of history as we know it was for him just the beginning of history as it ought to be. Karl Marx died in London in 1883. He was a stateless refugee, a man whose great prophecy of a world revolution had not come to pass in his lifetime. He left behind a vast, complex, difficult, and sometimes contradictory body of work. He left behind a scientific analysis of capitalism, a revolutionary call to arms, and a utopian vision for a classless future. And in the decades that followed his death, his followers, his critics, and the political movements that claimed his name would begin the great and difficult task of interpreting the master's legacy. This was the birth not of one single, unified Marxism. It was the birth of many different, competing, and often violently opposed Marxisms. Marx's scientific predictions were not coming true. The revolution had not happened in the advanced industrial countries of Western Europe. In fact, the condition of the working class in places like Germany and England was, in some ways, improving. They had won the right to vote. They had formed powerful trade unions. They were fighting for, and sometimes winning, better wages and working conditions through reform, not revolution. Capitalism did not seem to be on the verge of collapse. It seemed to be more powerful and more adaptable than ever. This created a profound crisis for the Marxist movement. Was the master wrong? Was the science of history flawed? It was in this context of doubt and crisis that the first great and most influential interpreter of Marx emerged. A man who would adapt Marx's theory to a new age, and in doing so, would change the course of the 20th. His name was Vladimir Ilyich Lenin. Lenin was a Russian revolutionary. A man of ferocious intellect and an even more ferocious will, he believed absolutely in the scientific truth of Marx's analysis, but he knew it needed to be updated. First, he had to answer the great question, why had the revolution failed to happen in the West? His answer was a new theory, laid out in his book Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism. He argued that capitalism had managed to save itself, temporarily, by exporting its own contradictions. The great capitalist powers of Europe had colonized the rest of the world. They were now extracting super profits from the cheap labor and raw materials of their colonies in Africa, in Asia, and in South America. They could then use a small portion of these colonial super profits to bribe their own working class at home with slightly higher wages and social reforms. This, he argued, had temporarily pacified the workers of the West and had dulled their revolutionary consciousness. The central contradiction of capitalism had not disappeared. It had simply been moved onto a global stage. The great class struggle was now between the oppressor nations of the imperialist West and the oppressed, colonized nations of the rest of the world. This led him to his second, and far more consequential, innovation. If the working class in the West had been temporarily bought off, then the revolution would have to begin somewhere else. It would have to begin in the weakest link of the imperialist chain. A country like his own, backward, semi-feudal, and brutally oppressive Tsarist Russia. But the Russian working class was small, uneducated, and not yet politically conscious. They were not, on their own, capable of making a revolution. And this led him to his most famous and most authoritarian contribution to Marxist theory, the idea of the vanguard party. Marx had believed that the proletariat would, through its own experience of struggle, naturally and spontaneously develop a revolutionary consciousness. Lenin disagreed. He argued that the working class, left to its own devices, was only capable of developing a trade union consciousness. The desire for better wages and working conditions within the capitalist system, not the desire to overthrow the system. To lead them to a true revolutionary consciousness, a different kind of organization was needed. A small, secret, highly disciplined, and centralized party of professional revolutionaries. An elite vanguard of Marxist intellectuals who would act as the general staff of the revolution. This party would bring the scientific truth of Marxism to the working class from the outside. It would guide them, organize them, and lead them in the seizure of power. In October of 1917, Lenin's theory was put to the ultimate test. His small, disciplined Bolshevik party did in fact seize power in Russia, creating the world's first socialist state. For millions around the world, this was the great moment of vindication. Marx's prophecy had come true. The revolution had finally arrived. But this triumph would give birth to a rigid, dogmatic, and ultimately totalitarian version of Marxism that would dominate the 20th century. Under Lenin's successor, Joseph Stalin, Marxism-Leninism became the official state religion of the Soviet Union, a tool used to justify the brutal industrialization of the country, the collectivization of agriculture, and the murder of millions in the Gulag. While this was happening in the East, a very different and far more critical tradition of Marxist thought was emerging in the West. Its birthplace was Germany, and its central problem was the opposite of Lenin's. The question for these thinkers was not how do we make a revolution? The question was, why did the revolution in the West fail? And not only had it failed, it had been defeated by a new and terrifying political monster, fascism. This was the great biographical agony of the thinkers who would come to be known as the Frankfurt School. They were a group of brilliant and mostly Jewish Marxist intellectuals working at the Institute for Social Research in Frankfurt. They witnessed firsthand the catastrophic failure of the German working class, the most organized and supposedly most revolutionary proletariat in Europe, to resist the rise of Hitler. In fact, a huge portion of them had enthusiastically embraced Nazism. This was a devastating blow to orthodox Marxist theory. If economic conditions were all that mattered, then the German working class, suffering under the Great Depression, should have turned to communism. Why did they turn to its opposite? Forced to flee Germany for their lives, these thinkers, men like Max Horkheimer, Theodor Adorno, and Herbert Marcuse, knew that Marx's original theory was missing something. They concluded that the superstructure, the realm of culture, of ideology, of psychology, was far more powerful and far more important than orthodox Marxists had believed. They turned away from a purely economic analysis and began to create a new kind of critical theory, blending the ideas of Marx with the philosophy of Hegel and the psychology of Freud. Their most famous answer was the theory of the culture industry. Adorno and Horkheimer argued that in modern, advanced capitalist societies, the old forms of direct, coercive control were no longer necessary. The system now controlled people through the seemingly harmless world of mass entertainment. Movies, popular music, television, magazines. This was not just innocent fun, it was an industry. A factory for producing standardized, predictable, and psychologically manipulative cultural products. The purpose of the culture industry, they argued, was to create passive, docile, and conformist consumers. It sells us a fantasy of rebellion while keeping us trapped in the system. It offers us a temporary escape from the misery of our alienated labor, only to make us more fit to return to that labor the next day. It constantly creates new, false needs that can only be satisfied by buying more commodities. It is a sophisticated system for preventing independent, critical thought. It keeps the population in a state of permanent distraction and psychic infancy. Another of these thinkers, Herbert Marcuse, would later argue, in his book One-Dimensional Man, that advanced consumer capitalism had become so total, so comfortable, that it had managed to absorb all forms of opposition. The system now satisfies so many of our superficial needs that we lose the very ability to desire something different. We come to love our own servitude. The working class has not been betrayed, it has been bought off, not with a bribe, but with a tidal wave of consumer goods and mindless entertainment. And so we are left with the great, fractured legacy of Karl Marx in the 20th century. In the East, his name was carved onto the banners of totalitarian states. His theories were turned into a rigid, almost religious dogma to justify the absolute power of a new, bureaucratic ruling class. In the West, his name became the inspiration for a group of profoundly pessimistic and disillusioned intellectuals who, having witnessed the catastrophic failure of the revolution, concluded that the cultural and psychological power of capitalism had become so total that a revolution was no longer even possible. The final tragic irony of the great materialist is that his most orthodox followers created a world he would have despised, while his most creative followers were forced to abandon his materialist faith and conclude that the true chains of oppression were not in the factory, but in the mind. This great fracture in the Marxist tradition, this split between the totalitarian dogma of the East and the pessimistic cultural critique of the West, forces us now to confront the single most difficult, most important, and most agonizing question of Karl Marx's entire legacy. What is the relationship between the ideas of the philosopher who spent his life in the quiet reading room of the British Museum and the vast frozen archipelago of concentration camps that his followers would build in his name? What is the connection between the utopian dream of a classless, stateless, and fully human society and the brutal, dystopian reality of the Soviet Gulag? This is the question of Marx and the Gulag. To engage with this question honestly, we must begin by stating the historical reality without flinching. The communist regimes of the 20th century in the Soviet Union, in China, in Cambodia, in Eastern Europe, and elsewhere were responsible for the deaths of tens of millions of human beings. They were responsible for state-engineered famines, for political purges, for mass executions, and for the creation of the most vast and murderous systems of slave labor that the world has ever known. This is the great and terrible historical indictment that stands at the feet of the Marxist project. Any honest appraisal of Marx's legacy that does not begin with a clear and unwavering acknowledgement of this fact is an act of intellectual and moral cowardice.
But what is the connection?
Was Marx the direct intellectual author of this horror, or was he a utopian humanist whose ideas were tragically and completely betrayed? This is the great debate that has haunted his legacy for a century. Let us, with intellectual honesty, examine the case for both sides. First, let us hear the case for the defense. This is the argument, made by many Marxists and scholars, that the Soviet Union and other so-called communist states were a complete and total distortion, a grotesque caricature of Marx's actual vision. This is the betrayal thesis. The first piece of evidence for this case is that the revolution happened in the wrong place. As we have seen, Marx's entire scientific theory was based on the idea that a socialist revolution could only happen in a country where capitalism was already highly developed. The revolution required the material preconditions that only advanced capitalism could create: a massive and organized industrial proletariat, a state of technological superabundance, and the global integration of the market. Russia, in 1917, had none of these things. It was a vast, semi-feudal, and overwhelmingly agrarian society. It was, in the language of Marxism, a backward country. To attempt to build a classless, stateless society on a foundation of poverty, scarcity, and a tiny working class was, from a strictly Marxist perspective, a complete and total absurdity. It was an attempt to build the roof of a house before the foundations had even been laid. Second, The defenders of Marx argue that the Soviet state itself was the very opposite of his vision. Marx's ultimate goal was the creation of a stateless and classless society. The transitional state, the dictatorship of the proletariat, was supposed to be a temporary and radically democratic tool that would begin to wither away as soon as its work was done. The Soviet state did not wither away. It became the most powerful, the most centralized, and the most monstrous state in human history. It did not smash the old oppressive machinery of the Tsarist state, it perfected it. Third, and most critically, the defenders argue that the Soviet Union did not abolish class, it created a new one. Instead of a classless society, what emerged in the Soviet Union was a system in which a new privileged and bureaucratic elite, the high-ranking members of the Communist Party, ruled over the rest of the population with an iron fist. This new class, as it was later called, did not own the means of production in their own name, like the old bourgeoisie, but they controlled it through their control of the state. They enjoyed immense power, privilege, and wealth, while the workers, in whose name they claimed to rule, remained in a state of profound and powerless exploitation. From this perspective, the Soviet Union was not a workers' state. It was a new and in many ways more brutal form of class society. It was a degenerated workers' state, or a form of state capitalism. Stalin, in this view, was not the heir of Karl Marx. He was his greatest and most effective betrayer. This is a powerful, and in many ways, a compelling case. But it is not the only one. We must now turn, with equal honesty, to the case for the prosecution. This is the argument that while Marx may not have personally drawn the blueprint for the Gulag, his own theories contain the dangerous and perhaps inevitable seeds of the tyranny that would follow. This is the seeds of tyranny thesis. The first piece of evidence is the very concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Regardless of what Marx may have intended by it, this phrase became, in the hands of his revolutionary followers, a blank check for absolute and unaccountable power. The idea that a transitional period of revolutionary dictatorship was necessary provided a perfect justification for the suppression of all political opposition, for the abolition of a free press, and for the use of revolutionary terror against anyone deemed to be an enemy of the people. It created a mindset in which the normal constraints of law and morality could be suspended in the name of a higher, historical goal. Second, there is Marx's profound and deeply held contempt for what he called bourgeois rights. He saw the entire liberal tradition of individual rights, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, the rule of law, the protection of the individual against the state, as nothing more than a sophisticated ideological trick. He believed these rights were designed to protect the property of the bourgeoisie and to create the illusion of a just society. But by dismissing these fundamental human rights as a mere bourgeois illusion, he disarmed his own followers against the rise of a new and far more total form of tyranny from within their own ranks. If freedom of speech is just a bourgeois prejudice, then what is wrong with censorship? If the rule of law is just a tool of the ruling class, then what is wrong with arbitrary arrests and show trials? The tragic irony is that the very bourgeois rights that Marx so scornfully dismissed were the only things that could have protected his own followers from the terror of the Stalinist state. Finally, and perhaps most damningly, there is the problem of Marx's claim to scientific certainty. As we have seen, Marx did not present his ideas as one possible opinion among many. He presented them as the objective, scientific, and irrefutable truth of history. They are an enemy of science. They are an enemy of reason. They are an enemy of history itself. They are an irrational obstacle to the inevitable march of progress. And an obstacle, of course, is something that must be removed. The biographical agony of Marx is that his own personality often mirrored this intolerant certainty. In his own life, he was a brilliant, but also a notoriously dogmatic, arrogant, and ruthless debater. He was merciless in his attacks on other socialists who dared to disagree with his scientific vision. His famous and bitter conflict with the anarchist Mikhail Bakunin is a testament to his own profound intolerance for intellectual dissent. The tragedy is that these personal traits, his certainty, his intolerance for opposition, his belief that he alone possessed the scientific key to history, were the very same traits that, when magnified to the level of absolute state power by his followers, would become the psychological and ideological foundation for the Gulag. So, what is the final verdict? It is perhaps true that Marx himself, the 19th-century humanist, who wept at the death of his own children, would have been horrified by the brutal reality of the Soviet state. But it is also true that he was a thinker whose own profound naivety about the nature of political power, whose own contempt for individual rights, and whose own fanatical and scientific certainty created a dangerous and tragic intellectual inheritance. And so we are left with the great unresolved and tragic legacy of Karl Marx. He was a philosopher who believed that the state would wither away, and his name was inscribed on the gates of the most powerful and murderous states in human history. The ultimate tragedy of Karl Marx is not that his vision was simply betrayed by his followers. It is that his vision contained both the beautiful, utopian dream of a perfect human freedom and hidden within the very same logic the dark and terrible seeds of a perfect human slavery. This tragic and bloody history of 20th-century communism, this great and terrible chasm between the utopian promise and the dystopian reality, forces us to ask an even more fundamental question. Was the problem simply a betrayal of Marx's ideas by his followers? Or were the ideas themselves, from their very beginning, built on a foundation of profound economic and historical errors? To engage with Marx honestly, we cannot only admire the power of his critique. We must also, with equal intellectual rigor, confront the most powerful and most enduring critiques of Marx. We must listen to the capitalist counter-argument. Let us begin with the most straightforward and most damaging critique of all, the failure of prophecy. Marx, as we have seen, did not present his vision of the future as a hopeful dream. He presented it as a scientific certainty, a prediction based on the iron laws of history and economics. And on this front, judged by his own standards, his theory has been a spectacular failure. The key, falsifiable predictions that he made about the future of capitalism have simply not come true. First, and most famously, there is the failure of the immiseration thesis. Marx believed that the logic of capitalism would inevitably lead to the absolute and relative impoverishment of the working class. The workers would get poorer and poorer, more and more miserable, until they were pushed to the brink of revolution. The historical reality has been the precise opposite. In the 50 years since Marx wrote Das Kapital, the standard of living for the average worker in the advanced capitalist countries has increased by a staggering, almost unimaginable amount. The proletariat of his day lived in a world without basic sanitation, without access to education, with rampant child labor, and with a life expectancy of perhaps 40 years. The working class of today, in these same countries, enjoys a level of material wealth, of comfort, of leisure, and of longevity that would have been completely unthinkable to the aristocrats of his time. Second, there is the failure of the polarization thesis. Marx predicted that the middle classes, the small shopkeepers, the independent artisans, would be crushed and pushed down into the proletariat, leaving society polarized into two and only two great classes. Again, the opposite has happened. Instead of disappearing, the middle class has grown enormously. The modern capitalist economy has created a vast and complex social structure, with a huge new middle class of managers, of technicians, of professionals, of white-collar workers, that does not fit neatly into his simple two-class model. And finally, the most obvious failure of his prophecy. The revolution did not happen where he said it would. It was supposed to be the inevitable result of the most advanced stage of industrial capitalism. It should have happened in Germany, in Britain, in the United States. Instead, the only successful Marxist revolutions took place in backward, semi-feudal, and overwhelmingly agrarian societies like Russia and China. This is not just a minor error, it is a direct and total refutation of his entire theory of historical materialism. So why were his predictions so wrong? This leads us to the second great critique, the one that strikes at the very heart of his economic system, the argument that his foundational theory of value is flawed. As we have seen, Marx's entire economic analysis, his theory of exploitation, of surplus value, is built upon the labor theory of value. The idea that the value of a commodity is determined by the amount of labor required to produce it. For almost all mainstream economists today, from the free market Austrians to the Keynesians, this theory is considered to be a relic of the 19th century. They argue that value is not an objective property that is injected into a commodity by labor. Value is subjective. The value of a thing is not determined by how much effort went into making it. It is determined by its usefulness to a particular person in a particular situation at a particular time. It is determined by the subjective desires of the consumer and the objective scarcity of the good. The classic illustration of this is the water-diamond paradox. Water is infinitely more useful for human survival than diamonds. If the labor theory were true, water should be far more valuable, but it is not. Why? Because water is abundant, and diamonds are scarce. And because human beings happen to subjectively desire the glittering beauty of diamonds. If this subjective theory of value is correct, then Marx's entire theory of exploitation collapses. If the value of a product is not created by the worker alone, but is co-created by the consumer's desire, by the entrepreneur's innovative idea, by the manager's skill in organizing production, and by the capitalist's willingness to risk their own capital, then profit is not a simple theft of surplus value. In this view, profit is the legitimate and necessary reward for the capitalist contribution, for their foresight, for their innovation, for their risk-taking, and for their ability to efficiently coordinate the complex process of production in a way that successfully satisfies the desires of the market. This leads to the third great critique, that Marx profoundly underestimated the dynamism and adaptability of capitalism. He saw the system's contradictions with brilliant clarity. But he was partially blind to its incredible and relentless capacity for creativity, for innovation, and for self-correction. He did not foresee the rise of the modern, regulated welfare state capitalism that emerged in the 20th century. This new system, often created in direct response to the political pressure from the very socialist and labor movements he helped to inspire, mitigated many of the brutal excesses of the 19th century capitalism he had observed. The creation of a social safety net, of unemployment insurance, of public health care, of regulations on working hours and safety conditions, all of these served to stabilize the system and to share its incredible wealth more broadly, thus preventing the very revolutionary conditions he had predicted. He also, crucially, had a blind spot for the role of the entrepreneur. In Marx's system, the capitalist is largely a parasitic figure, a mere owner. But the defenders of capitalism argue that the entrepreneur is the true revolutionary. It is the innovator, the risk-taker, the person who creates a new product, a new service, or a new way of organizing production, who is the real engine of progress and prosperity. They create new wealth, not just exploit existing labor. Finally, there is the great critique of the very idea of a communist future. This is the argument against central planning, most famously articulated by the Austrian economist Friedrich Hayek. It is called the knowledge problem. Marx's vision of a communist society, where production is rationally planned to meet human needs, sounds beautiful and humane. But Hayek argued that it is a practical impossibility. A complex, modern economy is a system of almost infinite complexity. It involves billions of individual desires, millions of different products, and a constantly changing landscape of technologies and resources. To rationally plan such a system, a central planning board would need to have access to all of this vast, dispersed, and constantly changing information. And this, Hayek argued, is impossible. The great genius of the free market, in this view, is that the price mechanism acts as a giant decentralized information system. Prices are not arbitrary. They are signals, communicating vast amounts of information about scarcity and desire, allowing billions of people to spontaneously coordinate their economic activities without any central direction. A central planner who abolishes prices is like a pilot who has smashed all of his instruments. He is flying blind. The inevitable results of this knowledge problem, the critics argue, were the chronic shortages, the massive inefficiency, and the catastrophic man-made famines that plagued every single centrally planned economy in the 20s. The biographical agony of Marx, in this light, is the agony of a brilliant mind in the grip of a powerful but flawed idea. It is the agony of a man who was so convinced of the scientific certainty of his own system that he was often willfully blind to the contradictory evidence all around him. He saw the suffering of the present with a devastating clarity. He was a genius at identifying the problems and the contradictions of the system. But his proposed solution, the critics argue, was a cure that was infinitely worse than the disease. And so we are faced with the final great irony of Karl Marx's economic critique. He was, without question, capitalism's most brilliant and most ferocious enemy. He dedicated his life to proving its inevitable demise. And yet, in doing so, he may have become one of its most important, if unwilling, saviors. The very movements that were inspired by his work, the unions, the socialist parties, the workers' movements, created the political pressure that forced capitalism to reform itself, to become more humane, to share its incredible wealth more broadly. The ghost of Karl Marx, the specter that has haunted the dreams of the bourgeoisie for over a century, is perhaps the very thing that has kept the system from succumbing to its own worst and most self-destructive instincts. This powerful and enduring critique of Marx's scientific predictions, this assault on the very foundations of his economic system, seems to leave us with a portrait of a failed 19th-century prophet, a man whose grand theories crumbled in the face of the 20th century's complex reality. But in 1932, a literary and philosophical bombshell was detonated, an event that would permanently and profoundly change our understanding of Karl Marx. In an archive in Moscow, a set of unpublished notebooks, written by a young, fiery, and almost unknown Karl Marx, were discovered and published for the first time. And the man who emerged from these pages was not the cold, deterministic scientist of Das Kapital. He was not the ruthless political agitator of the Communist Manifesto. He was a passionate, a profound, and a deeply humanist philosopher. These texts, which we now know as the economic and philosophic manuscripts of 1844, were written when Marx was just 26 years old, living as a young exile in Paris. They were never published in his lifetime. For nearly a century, the world did not know they existed. Their discovery caused an earthquake in the world of Marxist thought. It revealed a Marx before Marxism. It showed that the entire vast and complex architecture of his later economic and political work was built upon a deep and deeply moral philosophical foundation. It revealed that the starting point for his entire life's work was not a scientific analysis of the rate of profit. It was an agonized and compassionate cry against what the modern world was doing to the human soul. The central concept of these early manuscripts, the great beating heart of the young Marx's thought, is the concept we have already explored: alienation. But in these early writings, alienation is not just an economic category. It is a profound, almost existential state of being. It is a spiritual sickness. The young Marx argues that the entire history of humanity, up to this point, the entire story of class society and private property, is the story of our progressive alienation from our true human nature. And what is that nature? He calls it our species. This is his philosophical anthropology, his theory of what makes us human. Our species being, he argues, is our nature as free, conscious, and creative producers. We are, at our core, artists. Our fundamental desire is to see ourselves reflected in a world that we have created through our own free and conscious labor. This is what separates us from the animals. A bee builds a honeycomb, but it does so according to a fixed, unconscious instinct. A human being, he argues, can build a house, or compose a symphony, or write a poem. We can hold an idea in our mind, and then transform the material world to match that idea. This free creative activity is the essence of our humanity. It is the source of our dignity and our joy. And the great tragedy of capitalism for the young Marx is that it systematically alienates us from this essential nature. As we have seen, it alienates us from the product of our labor, which becomes a hostile power that rules over us. It alienates us from the act of labor itself, which becomes a miserable, forced chore rather than a joyful, creative activity. And it alienates us from each other, turning us into competitors in a brutal economic game. But the deepest tragedy of all is that it alienates us from ourselves, from our own species being. It takes the very activity that should be the affirmation of our humanity, our creative labor, and it turns it into a denial of our humanity. We are reduced to the level of a machine or a beast of burden. This early, humanistic work also reveals a far more nuanced and complex vision of the communist future. It shows that Marx was fiercely critical of what he called crude, unthinking communism. He saw this simplistic version of communism, which was popular among some revolutionaries of his time, as being motivated not by a desire for human liberation, but by a profound and universal envy. This crude communism, he argued, did not want to overcome alienation. Its only goal was to drag everyone down to the same low level. Its only principle was a forced, unnatural equality. He wrote that this kind of communism does not actually abolish private property, it simply universalizes it. The community becomes the universal capitalist, and every single person becomes a wage laborer. It is a vision of a universal barracks, a society of total and envious mediocrity. This is a crucial insight. It shows that Marx's ultimate goal was not just economic equality. It was the creation of a new, richer, more fully developed, and more fully human kind of individual. His utopia was not about having less, it was about being more. The biographical agony that hangs over these manuscripts is the agony of their silence. For nearly a century, the world did not have this key. The world knew only the mature, scientific Marx of Das Kapital, the deterministic prophet of historical laws. And it was this version of Marx, the cold, hard, scientific Marx, that could be, and was, used to justify the dehumanizing, totalitarian, and soul-crushing regimes of the 20s. The leaders of these states could claim to be following the scientific laws of history as they built their great industrial crystal palaces. They could justify the suffering of millions by pointing to the inevitable march of the dialectic. The great tragedy is that Marx's own most powerful and most profound critique of a dehumanizing system, his passionate philosophical defense of the free and creative human individual, lay buried and unknown in an archive. The world had the what of his revolution, but for 100 years it had lost the why. The discovery of these early writings in 1932 created a great and lasting schism in the interpretation of his work. It led to the great debate: was there one Marx, or two? On one side were thinkers like the French philosopher Louis Althusser. They argued for a sharp epistemological break in Marx's thought. They claimed that the young humanist Marx of the 1844 manuscripts was an ideological, pre-scientific thinker, still trapped in the language of Hegelian philosophy. The mature Marx, the author of Das Kapital, they argued had made a clean break with this youthful humanism, and had created a true, objective science of history. For them, the early writings were an interesting, but ultimately irrelevant piece of juvenilia. They claimed that the early humanistic concerns about alienation, about freedom, about the full development of the human individual were not abandoned in his later works. They were the silent, moral, and passionate engine that drove his entire scientific economic analysis. In this view, Das Kapital is not just a cold, scientific treatise. It is a work of profound and sustained moral outrage. It is a multi-thousand-page scream against a system that mutilates the human soul. And you cannot truly understand the scientific critique unless you first understand the humanistic passion that fuels it. And so we are left with the ghost of another Karl Marx. For half a century, the world knew only the scientist, the iron-fisted prophet of historical inevitability. And in his name, regimes were built that treated human beings as mere cogs in a great deterministic machine. But all the while, his most passionate and most human work, his agonized cry against the spiritual emptiness of the modern world, lay silent in a dusty archive. The final, and perhaps most tragic, alienation of Karl Marx was the alienation of his own legacy from his own heart. This great debate between the scientific Marx and the humanist Marx, between the iron laws of history and the agonized cry against alienation, raises a crucial question for us in the 20th. Which of his ideas still speak to us? Which of his tools still have the power to cut through the noise of our own time and to illuminate the world we are living in right now? While many of his specific economic predictions have failed, and while his vision of a communist future has been buried under the rubble of the 20th century, one of his earliest, strangest, and most philosophical concepts has become more relevant, more prescient, and more terrifyingly accurate than he could have ever imagined. This is the enduring and prophetic power of his theory of commodity fetishism. Let us briefly recall the core of this idea. It is Marx's theory of modern magic. It is the explanation for how, in a capitalist society, the real social and human relationships between people become hidden from us and reappear in our daily lives in a mystified and ghostly form, as if they were objective, economic relationships between things. In Marx's own time, this was a new and emerging phenomenon, a strange feature of the new industrial world. In our time, it is no longer a feature. It is the very air we breathe. It is the water we swim in. It is the fundamental logic that structures our entire reality. To understand its totalizing power, let us perform a Marxist analysis on the single most iconic commodity of our age, the smartphone. What is this object that you hold in your hand, that you carry with you every moment of the day? Now, let us, with a Marxist lens, disenchant this object. Let us look behind the magical veil of the marketplace and see the hidden world of human social relationships that are crystallized within it. The journey of your phone began, perhaps, in the mines of the Democratic Republic of Congo. There, men and often children work in horrific, unsafe conditions, digging with their bare hands for the cobalt and the coltan that are necessary to make its battery and its circuits work. This is the first hidden social relationship in your phone. A relationship of neo-colonial exploitation of human suffering that is completely invisible to the final consumer. From there, these raw materials are shipped to vast continent-sized factories in places like Shenzhen, China. There, hundreds of thousands of workers, mostly young women who have migrated from poor rural villages, are organized into a vast, disciplined army of labor. They work brutally long hours, performing the same tiny, repetitive task, thousands upon thousands of time a day, often for wages that are barely enough to survive on. They live in crowded dormitories. Their lives are governed by the relentless, inhuman rhythm of the global production schedule. This is the second hidden social relationship in your phone, the direct industrial exploitation of human labor power on a massive scale. Meanwhile, in the corporate offices of California, another set of social relationships is at work. Thousands of brilliant and highly paid engineers and designers perform the immense intellectual labor required to create the phone's software and its elegant hardware. They are also selling their labor power, but under far more privileged conditions. They create the advertisements that associate the phone not with the suffering of the miners and the factory workers, but with creativity, with connection, with freedom, with a desirable way of life. And finally, the phone arrives in a store where a retail employee, often working for a low hourly wage with little job security, performs the final act of labor, selling the fetishized object to you. All of this vast, complex, and global network of human sweat, of suffering, of genius, of exploitation, of human relationships, is the true social reality of your phone. But the magic of the market is that it erases all of it. The market is a great act of social amnesia. It takes this object, which is dripping with the history of these human relationships, and it washes it clean. And it presents it to you as a pristine, magical commodity, whose only relevant quality is its price. The immense, invisible web of human connection and exploitation is transformed into a simple, quantitative relationship between a thing and a sum of money. This is the fetishism of commodities in its purest form. But in the 21st century, this process has gone even deeper. We have moved beyond just fetishizing the products we buy. We now fetishize the brand. A brand is pure, distilled fetishism. It is a corporate logo that, through the relentless work of the culture industry, has been imbued with a soul. Nike is not just a shoe, it is the spirit of athletic greatness, of just do it. Apple is not just a computer, it is the spirit of creativity, of innovation, of think different. We no longer just consume products. We form personal, emotional, and almost spiritual relationships with these abstract corporate fictions. They have become the modern totems. We use them to construct our own identities. The ancient and deeply human act of defining who you are is replaced by the commercial act of choosing which set of fetishes you will adorn yourself with. You are what you buy. And this logic has now reached its final, most totalizing stage in the world of social media, with the rise of the human commodity. The influencer, the content creator, the personality, this is the final frontier of commodity fetishism. Here it is the human being themselves, their life, their personality, their relationships, their supposed authenticity, that is consciously and deliberately turned into a commodity to be marketed and sold. The social relationship, a follower's admiration for a person, is systematically transformed into an economic relationship, a consumer's loyalty to a brand. The line between the human and the commodity dissolves completely. The biographical agony of Karl Marx was that he was a man living in the dawn of this new enchanted world. He was a supreme rationalist who saw, with horror that the new scientific and supposedly rational system of capitalism was in fact creating a new and more powerful form of superstition than the world had ever known. His life's work was an attempt to break this spell. But the agony of our time is that we are no longer in the dawn. We are in the high noon of the fetish. We live our lives so completely immersed in this world of magical things and talking brands that we have lost the very ability to see the human relationships that lie hidden behind them. And so we are left with the final, haunting triumph of the commodity. Marx described a world where the relationships between people were disguised as relationships between things. We have perfected his vision. We live in a world that is more technologically interconnected than ever, a world where we can communicate with anyone on the planet in an instant. And yet, we have never been more profoundly alienated from the global family of human beings whose invisible labor creates the very fabric of our lives. We are surrounded by an infinity of magical objects, and yet we have never been more spiritually impoverished. The great and terrible magic of the modern world is that we have learned how to speak to anyone, anywhere. But we have completely forgotten how to see the human face in the objects we hold in our own hands. This haunted and mystified world of the commodity, this system that separates us from our own creations and from each other, seemed to reach its absolute and final zenith at the end of the 20th. In 1989, the Berlin Wall, the great concrete symbol of the Cold War, came crashing down. 2 years later, the Soviet Union itself, the great and terrible empire that had been built in Marx's name, dissolved into history. A great wave of triumphalism swept across the Western world. The battle was over. The great ideological struggle that had defined the 20th century had a clear and decisive winner. Capitalism and its political partner, liberal democracy, had won. A famous political theorist, Francis Fukuyama, captured the mood of the time with a now infamous phrase. He declared that this was the end of history. He did not mean that events would stop happening. He meant that the great dialectical struggle of human history was over. Humanity had found the final and best possible form of social, political, and economic organization. There were no serious alternatives left. And in this new, triumphant, post-historical world, Karl Marx was finally definitively dead and buried. His ideas were seen as a relic, a dangerous and discredited 19th century prophecy that had led only to poverty, tyranny, and the Gulag. He was a false prophet, a god that had failed. His books were relegated to the dusty shelves of academia, a historical curiosity to be studied alongside the alchemists and the astrologers. The specter that had haunted Europe was, it seemed, finally exorcised. For nearly 2 decades, this triumphalist narrative held. The 1990s and the early 2000s were the age of neoliberal globalization, of a seemingly unstoppable and self-regulating free market. The world, it was believed, was becoming flatter, more prosperous, and more democratic. The great, agonizing questions of the past had been solved. And then, in September of 2008, the Crystal Palace shattered. The collapse of the investment bank Lehman Brothers triggered the most severe global financial crisis since the Great Depression. The entire complex and interconnected global financial system, a system that was supposed to be perfectly rational and self-correcting, was suddenly on the verge of a total, catastrophic meltdown. It was a moment of profound and terrifying disillusionment. The triumphant certainty of the end of history evaporated overnight. The old, forgotten questions, the questions that Marx had asked a century and a half earlier, suddenly came roaring back with a vengeance. What are the inherent contradictions of this system? Is it truly stable? Does it serve the interests of the many, or only of a tiny few? In the midst of this crisis, something strange and unexpected began to happen. Sales of Das Kapital started to surge. A new generation of students, of activists, and even of mainstream economists, a generation that had grown up after the Cold War, began to pull Marx's books down from the dusty shelves. They were not looking for a new dogma to believe in. They were looking for a set of tools. They were looking for a language to describe and to critique a system that had suddenly and violently revealed its own profound irrationality. This was the beginning of the great, unlikely, and still ongoing return of Karl Marx. The 2008 crisis was the first great crack in the wall of post-historical certainty, but it was soon followed by others, a series of interlocking crises that have come to define the 21st century and which Marx's work seemed to have prophetically diagnosed. The first is the crisis of inequality. In the decades following the fall of the Berlin Wall, while the world celebrated the triumph of the free market, a massive and unprecedented concentration of wealth was taking place. The rich were not just getting richer, they were entering a new stratosphere of wealth that was completely disconnected from the reality of ordinary people. The language of the 1% entered the global conversation. Suddenly, Marx's old 19th-century analysis of the polarization of classes, of the relentless concentration of capital in the hands of a tiny minority, no longer seemed like a failed prophecy. It looked like a live stream of the 21st century global economy. His description of a world increasingly divided between a global bourgeoisie and a global proletariat seemed more accurate than ever. The second great crisis that has fueled the return of Marx is the climate crisis. Marx himself was not an environmental thinker in the modern sense, but a new and powerful school of thought, eco-Marxism, has argued that his core critique of capitalism is essential for understanding our current ecological catastrophe. The fundamental logic of capitalism, as Marx described it, is the logic of endless accumulation. The system must constantly grow, constantly produce more, constantly consume more, or it will collapse. It is a system that treats the natural world not as a home to be cherished, but as a collection of free raw materials to be exploited for profit. The eco-Marxists argue that this logic of infinite expansion is on a direct collision course with the reality of a finite planet. The climate crisis, in this view, is not an accident. It is the predictable and inevitable result of a system whose very DNA is based on a war against all natural limits. And finally, there is the enduring crisis of alienation. The modern office worker, sitting in a cubicle, answering an endless stream of emails, is just as alienated from the final product of their labor as the 19th century factory worker. And the world of social media and consumer culture is the world of commodity fetishism, on an almost unimaginable scale. We are a generation that is constantly being told that our identity is something to be curated, to be branded, and to be sold. The biographical agony of our time is the agony of a generation that was born at the supposed end of history, that was promised a future of stable, prosperous, and democratic capitalism, and that has instead inherited a world of profound economic instability, of catastrophic ecological risk, and of deep spiritual alienation. The return to Marx is a symptom of this agony. It is a search for a more powerful, more radical, and more systematic critique of a world that feels increasingly out of control. It is the ghost of Marx the critic, Marx the diagnostician, Marx the great, angry, and brilliant analyst of the contradictions of the capitalist system. And so we are left with the final, great, and haunting irony of the specter of communism. At the very moment of its supposed final death, at the moment when the last statues of Lenin were being torn down and history was declared to be over, the ghost of Karl Marx was quietly and patiently being reborn. His prophecies of a communist future failed. But his diagnosis of the capitalist present has, for a new and disillusioned generation, come to seem more terrifyingly accurate than ever. He was the great loser of the 20th century. And yet, he may turn out to be the most essential and most unavoidable philosopher of the time. This surprising return of Marx's specter, this ghostly reappearance of a thinker who was supposed to be dead and buried, forces us to a final reckoning. After our long journey through his life, his science, his prophecies, and his catastrophic, blood-soaked legacy, what is the ultimate meaning of his work? What is the final enduring message of Karl Marx? The answer, I believe, is found not in the thousands of dense and difficult pages of Das Kapital, but in a single short, explosive sentence he wrote as a young man. A sentence that he scribbled in a notebook and that was never published in his lifetime. It is his famous 11th thesis on Feuerbach, and it is the statement that represents his fundamental break with the entire history of philosophy that came before him. He wrote, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point is to change it. This is the key. This is the Rosetta Stone that unlocks his entire, vast, and complex project." Marx was not interested in creating another abstract system to be debated in the quiet, comfortable halls of a university. He had a profound and almost contemptuous impatience for philosophy that remained a purely contemplative, academic, and passive activity. For him, thought that does not lead to action is a form of self-indulgence. The purpose of a great idea is not to be understood, it is to be wielded. He believed that the purpose of theory was to be united with practice, a concept he called praxis, to become a material force that could literally transform the world. His philosophy was not a lens through which to merely see the world. It was a hammer with which to shatter it and a blueprint with which to rebuild it. And so, as we conclude our journey, let us look back one last time at the great intellectual edifice he built, and see it now through the light of this final revolutionary thesis. First, he created a method. His historical materialism, his inversion of the Hegelian dialectic, was not just a new way to interpret the past. It was a tool for discovering the laws of motion of society, a science that would allow the revolutionary class to understand its precise historical moment and the necessary steps it had to take. Then he used this method to create a critique. His entire devastating analysis of capitalism, his theory of class struggle, his profound and humanistic concept of alienation, his scientific dissection of surplus value, his unmasking of the mystical fetishism of commodities. This was not just an act of scholarly analysis, it was the act of a great diagnostician, a doctor who was not just describing the symptoms of a sick society, but was exposing the underlying pathology in order to arm the patients for a fight for their own lives. And finally, he used this critique to forge a prophecy. His vision of the inevitable contradictions of capitalism, of the rising consciousness of the proletariat, of the coming revolution, and of a final, utopian, communist future. This was not a passive prediction. It was a call to arms. It was a story designed to give the working class a sense of its own historical destiny, to transform its individual suffering into a collective world-changing mission. But this brings us to the great tragic contradiction of his legacy. He did, in fact, change the world more than any philosopher in human history. The Marxist revolutions of the 20th century in Russia, in China, and elsewhere reshaped the lives of billions of human beings. The fear of his ideas, the specter of communism, was a primary force that led to the creation of the modern welfare state in Western Europe, as capitalist countries were forced to mitigate their own worst excesses to prevent their own working classes from turning to revolution. The very language we use today to talk about society, our concepts of class, of capitalism, of ideology, of exploitation, is profoundly and inescapably shaped by his work. But he did not change the world in the way he intended. His dream of a radically democratic, stateless, and fully human society became, in the hands of his followers, a nightmare of totalitarian oppression. His humanistic cry against alienation was used to justify a system that produced a new and in many ways more total form of alienation. This is the ultimate and most profound biographical agony of his legacy. He was a thinker whose ideas were powerful enough to shape the course of history, but not powerful enough to control it. He was a modern Prometheus who stole a new kind of fire, the fire of historical self-consciousness, and gave it to humanity. But he could not control the terrible, world-consuming conflagrations that were started with his gift. So where does this leave us? What is the value of Karl Marx today in a world after the collapse of the Soviet Union, in a world dominated by a global, hyper-advanced, and seemingly triumphant capitalism? His ultimate value for us in the 21st century lies not in his failed answers, but in his enduring and deeply uncomfortable questions. His work is not a blueprint to be followed. It is a set of critical tools to be used. He does not give us a map to a future utopia. He gives us a ruthless, unflinching, and eternally necessary X-ray of our present reality. And he leaves us with a series of questions that we, in our own time, are still struggling to answer. When you look at your own work, do you feel a sense of creative human fulfillment, or do you, on some level, still feel the quiet, modern ache of alienation? When you look at our society, with its incredible wealth and its persistent poverty, with its glamorous celebrities and its invisible gig economy workers, do you see a harmonious community? Or do you see a fundamental and ongoing conflict between the interests of a tiny minority who own so much and the interests of the vast majority who own so little? When you look at our culture, at our politics, at our media, at our most cherished ideas of freedom and success, do you dare to ask the great unsettling Marxist question, cui bono, who benefits? Whose interests do these ideas and these institutions truly serve? This is the living legacy of Karl Marx. It is not a dead dogma. It is a method of critical inquiry. It is a permanent and necessary tradition of suspicion towards all forms of power. And so we are left with the great, final, and most vital paradox of Karl Marx. His prophecies of a communist future failed. His utopian solutions led to catastrophe. His scientific system is, in many of its details, obsolete. And yet he is more necessary, more relevant, and more dangerous to us now than ever before. We are not, and we should not be, Marxists in the old dogmatic sense. But we must, if we are to be conscious citizens of the 21st century, become students of Marx. We must pick up his tools, not to build his particular heaven, but to better understand and to critique our own very real and very present. His ultimate legacy is not a map to the future. It is a ruthless, unflinching, and eternally necessary X-ray of the present. He is the ghost that will not be exorcised, the specter that continues to haunt our triumphant capitalist world, not because he offers us a paradise to come, but because he forces us again and again to confront the injustices, the contradictions, and the hidden human cost of the world we are living in right now.